Welcome back, guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If, with another fanfiction. This is the move of what if Deku reclaimed his future? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Izuku Midoriya, age 21, stared at the office space in front of him. It wasn't much to look at. In fact, it was more akin to a broom closet than the other more established hero agencies he shared his building with. But the new paint job gave the room a warm atmosphere, and while the leather couch and chairs were second-hand and used, they were in excellent condition and far better than the folding chairs he was prepared to use for his sitting room before this morning. The wood floors were polished to the point where Izuku felt terrible about walking on them, and the cabinets were filled to the brim with every type of office supply he would need in the coming days. Of course, it wasn't something many people should be excited about, but damn it, he was actually looking forward to putting his pens and highlighters to good use when he needed to fill out mission reports. Because most importantly, the office and everything in it was all his. The embodiment of what he built with his own hands and years of hard work. That's what mattered the most to him. His office could have been a cardboard box on the street for all Izuku cared, as long as he could do what he needed to do. Be a hero. He sighed as he happily took a seat on the couch of his waiting area, imagining for a moment the potential clients that would come through his doors in the coming days. It was nerve-wracking to say the least. Over 50% of hero agencies go under within the first 5 years of operation, either being bought out and absorbed into more prominent and established hero agencies or taken over directly by the Hero Commission or one of its partners. It was a rough road ahead for anyone, let alone a 21-year-old who had never officially worked for a hero agency and someone who, technically, dropped out of hero school before his second year. Not to mention being back in Japan after so long. Izuku's mood darkened for a moment, the memories flooded back to him all at once. This was a long time coming to say the least, but a decision he couldn't allow himself to regret making. After all, he spent 5 years traveling the world hiding from his past, and it didn't do him any good pretending what had happened didn't actually happen. It was why he decided to move back home after all, to try and pick up the pieces of his shattered life. A knock on the door took Izuku out of his thoughts. The commission representative had arrived earlier than expected. Izuku was just happy the office looked as decent as it did. He didn't want to start his new life on the wrong foot. So he stood, checked his appearance in the reflection of the polished window, and put on the most professional face his nerves allowed him to have. However, the professional mask he had perfected the 5 years away from home shattered when he saw exactly who was at the door. "Eraserhead," Izuku said stiffly as he regarded the older man. Clearly, this was not who he expected to see today, nor was it the person he wanted to see. But if the stack of papers in the man's hands was an indication, then his former teacher was the commission representative he was set to meet. What joy. The man looked similar to when Izuku saw him last, minus the addition of the prosthetic leg of course. But he looked uncomfortable standing in front of Izuku, something the young man took some pleasure in for a moment before squashing the emotion down. "Midoriya," the man gritted out, hiding half his face from view with his capture weapon. He sounded familiar, just like how Izuku remembered the man did years ago, but there was a strange hesitation to his words. It's been a while. 5 years, Izuku thought to himself. It had been 5 years since he last laid eyes on the man. 6 years since he had spoken to the man. Their last conversation never entirely left Izuku's mind in the 6 years that passed, despite Izuku's best efforts. "You're an absolute disgrace," Azoiwa-sensei had said to him, spitting the words like they were poison as he turned away from the boy in the prison cell. "And you deserve everything that happens to you from this point on." Izuku always thought that would be the last memory he would ever have of the sleep-deprived hero. Guess he was wrong. "Please come in," Izuku said politely if a little coldly as he held the door open for his former homeroom teacher. The older man stood frozen for a moment before entering the office without a word. "I wasn't aware I'd be meeting with an underground hero to file paperwork. The commission still can't be worried over my loyalty, can they?" The words struck the underground hero like a fist, breaking whatever calm demeanor the man had cultivated since coming back into Izuku's life. If Izuku didn't know any better, he would have assumed he had rattled the man, something Izuku would have smiled at if it had happened a few years ago. But instead, Izuku chided himself mentally. Being passive-aggressive wasn't going to help anyone, especially not now. He was home to get over his past, not wallow in it. "Standard procedure," the one-legged man said as he sat down on the couch, his face returning to its ordinary emotionless mask. However, his voice still held the raw emotion that shone from his face just a moment ago. After everything that had happened these past few years, The commission made it standard for these meetings to be more hands-on, to minimize potential scandals down the line. Izuku paused slightly at the word scandal but quickly recovered. It made sense. Izuku didn't like it, but it made sense. The reveal of the hero Sliding Go being a high-ranking member of the Paranormal Liberation Army while an active hero had been a national embarrassment, even more so than the sudden retirement of Yoroi Musha and several other high-profile heroes at the apex of the war against the PLA. The less said about Endeavor and the myriad of his issues, the better. He shouldn't be shocked at the added scrutiny the Hero Commission was pushing to flush out potential villains and undesirable traits from their ranks. But even though Izuku knew this approach made sense, it wasn't the real reason the Hero Commission representative had to be his former homeroom teacher. The words didn't lie, at least not in a technical sense. But that didn't mean they were the whole truth. But at this point, whatever was the reason his teacher was here wasn't Izuku's business anymore. He just wanted it to be done. Izuku sat down across from his former teacher without a sound. He did his best to ignore his teacher's stare as he read through the assembled paperwork with an experienced eye. The first lesson you learn as an independent contractor in the international heroics industry is reading the fine print of government contracts. He didn't want a repeat of those 6 months in Hong Kong. So he refused to spend another day longer than he had to behind bars, being an undercover informant or otherwise. This is a nice place, Eraserhead said, his eyes scanning the simple yet comfortable-looking office. A lot better than my first offices at least. Thanks. Izuku said, without lifting his eyes off a particular dense paragraph regarding the Commission's new regulations regarding team-ups between heroes of different agencies. Can't say I was ever good with decorating. You decorated it yourself? The underground hero asked, confusion radiating from his voice. Would have assumed your agency would have at least set you up with the basics before your transfer. Oh, I don't work for an agency, Izuku said as he signed his name to a non-disclosure agreement. The commission put me on probation when I stepped off the plane from America. Izuku glanced up for a moment, seeing his former teacher's eyes widen in shock. Izuku watched the man for a second more, trying to remember each subtle movement of the underground hero's face. Was this him being happy that Izuku had to go through this hassle? Or was he upset that despite the roadblocks, Izuku found himself on equal footing despite his setbacks? Yeah, it is illegal for an accredited hero agency to hire someone on probation, Izuku added, turning his attention back to the paperwork. But turns out though it's not actually illegal for someone on probation to start their own agency. It was a significant loophole that hadn't been used since the beginning years of Hero Society. He had patted himself on the shoulder for literal days after discovering it. The commission didn't seem to think so, but Izuku was starting to realize that the dislike the Hero Commission held for him was a weight he was willing to bear. An intake of breath caught Izuku's attention as he raised his eyes off the paperwork in front of him and towards his former teacher. The man was rigid as if shocked by some unknown electric quirk. His eyes were wide, and while he couldn't see the lower half of the man's face, Izuku knew the underground hero's lips had become twisted into a scowl. It was a look Izuku could never forget after all. It's not a big deal, Izuku said, his voice betraying nothing as he spoke. After 5 years of doing jobs no one wanted to do, it feels good being my own boss. Eraserhead said nothing, but if his hands balling into tight fists against the brown leather seat was anything to go by, the man was clearly wrestling with something, but for his life, Izuku couldn't figure out what. Either that or he didn't care all too much. Izuku placed his signature on the last packet of papers, neatly packing them into the manila folders they came in. Eraserhead reached his hand out silently, pausing as he looked towards Izuku before standing up from the couch. If that's all you need me for, Izuku said as he motioned towards the door, then I wish you a good rest of your day. Some would call him abrupt, but Izuku had a lot of things he had to do before starting his first official day as a registered hero. Dot the I's and cross the T's as they say. He also knew that his former teacher was as uncomfortable as he was about this impromptu reunion. But, despite everything, Izuku wasn't the type of person to prolong someone's suffering if he could help it. He also didn't want to spend time with his ex-teacher any longer than he had to. The underground hero stood awkwardly, looking like a deer caught in the headlights, and for a brief moment, Izuku wondered if that was what he looked like all those years ago? But whatever internal struggle Eraserhead was dealing with was not Izuku's problem. Hero or otherwise, some things couldn't be fixed with a bright smile or an offered hand to lift someone up. Listen, Midoriya? Eraserhead started before he seemingly gave up, the weight of his words too heavy for him to bear. He ambled to the door, his footsteps feeling more solemn and labored than those with whom he entered the office. Izuku felt a rush of relief when he finally closed the door, a polite good night, barely leaving his lips by the time his ex-teacher left his vision. He took a calming breath and closed his eyes, falling backward into his office chair behind his desk. For a while, the only sounds Izuku could hear were traffic outside his office walls and the sound of his own heartbeat slowly but surely returning to normal. Well, Izuku said to himself that the minor panic attack was entirely under control before it overcame him. That wasn't so bad. Principal Nedu leaned forward into his chair, leaning against his paws as he stared into the paperwork in front of him. He scanned each line after the other, memorizing every detail regarding his former charge that the papers told him. But as each detail burned into his eyes, he couldn't help but feel the frustration bristle his fur as he clenched his paws tight together. The ramble of his subordinates was not helping in the slightest. "Shoyuta," President Mike said, his voice pleading as he tried vainly to calm his best friend down. "You're starting to freak me out." His friend's words did little to sway the underground hero from his action as he stared blankly out the window of Nezu's office overlooking the courtyard. He hadn't said a word since he arrived back on campus, ignoring the calls and words of students and staff members as he made his way to the principal's office. He shuffled limply like a zombie moving on nothing more than blind instinct. He hadn't even noticed the forms of his fellow teachers follow him as he tossed the packet of paperwork onto Nezu's desk. Not the best sign, Nedu thought as he looked back to the paperwork, biting back the bile that threatened to leave his throat as he saw the familiar and haunting signature on the papers. Not the best sign at all. President Mike shook his friend's shoulder, his confusion twisting into general worry as his normally stoic friend refused to acknowledge him. Snipe had gone to grab the nurse, UA's newest employee, the young healing hero White Mage, hoping the young woman could help with her healing touch. 13 and Cementos looked on in concern, their mutterings doing little to settle Nezu's growing frustration. At least Eraser had the decency to remain quiet while Nedu thought about what he needed to do. "Is someone gonna explain what's going on?" Vlad said, crossing his massive arms against his broad chest. "What happened to Eraser? Where did you send him?" Nedu stared the man down, the principal's black eyes looking less human than they usually did. In times like this, Nezu's inhumanness shone brightly despite the creature's intelligence. Then, finally, the muttering stopped as if the whole room suddenly realized that whatever was happening, it was something that should be treated seriously. "Midoriya," Shoyuta said, his voice hollow and raw, less like a voice and more like a wounded animal trying to crawl out of his voice, "is back in Japan." All noise seemed to die in the room. For once, Nedu was allowed to think uninterruptedly. He looked back towards the commission forms the young man had signed a few hours ago, memorizing the details in front of him like his life depended on it. "Wah," President Mike said, his eyes widened in horror and shame as he stepped away from his friend like he had been punched in the gut. "What do you mean Is he okay?" Midnight said, crossing the room's length in long strides as she met Shuta's eyes. The 18-plus heroine's eyes shone with emotion. Each thought she had for the boy these past few years had come to surface all at once. "Where has he been? What did he say?" "Kiki." Shoyuta spoke, stopping as he sucked in a breath and looked towards his friends and co-workers with a face Nedu had rarely seen on the stoic man's face. "He didn't say anything." As if at once, the air in the room seemed to disappear, sucking the life out of the heroes crowding Nedu's desk. Nedu sat silently, his breathing becoming labored as he watched one of the most competent men he had ever met in his career in the middle of a nervous breakdown in front of his eyes. "I sat before him for 30 minutes trying to say 2 words to him," Shoyuta said, trying to will control back into his body as he stared back towards the window and away from the horror-stricken faces of the room's occupants. 5 years and I couldn't even bring myself to say I was sorry." "Shoyuta?" President Mike tried to put his hand on the Eraser hero's shoulder, but his friend shrugged it off as if physical contact caused the man pain. Then the room's climate shifted, and each teacher except for Shoyuta looked toward Nedu with pleading and desperate eyes. For confirmation or for something else, the small mammal didn't know. "It is exactly what Shoyuta said." Nedu interrupted, leaning back into his chair with a sigh as the rest of the room's occupants placed their undivided attention on the small principal. "Izuku Midoriya is officially a hero registered with the Heroics Commission. His exile, as it were, has been lifted." "No, it's not," Shoyuta said, turning to look at Nedu with a semblance of his usual tone of voice. "The commission refused to lift Izuku's ban. He's still under probation until the commission believes he has shown his loyalty." Nedu felt his fur bristle as he clenched his paws together. He shouldn't be surprised at the commission's actions, but even that thought couldn't erase the disgust he felt for what was happening to the young man. He had already suffered more than anyone should, but this? It was an insult added to injury and beyond what could be considered normal. It had caused quite a stir among the hero ranks when the commission decided to levy punishments for crimes proven without a shred of doubt not to have happened. 5 years was a long time for a teenager to put his heroic's career on hold. What are you talking about? Midnight asked, her eyes shining with confusion and disgust as she said the word. The commission practically threw Izuku out of the country. Nedu nodded his small head at the words. He was fearful something like this would happen whenever Izuku decided he wanted to return to Japan. But, on the other hand, he was just surprised the commission would have been so blatant. They wanted him to work for the commission. Nedu said, his eyes widening as everything began to make sense. First, the commission's punishment even after Izuku was exonerated for the crimes he was charged with. The commission refusing to authorize Izuku's transfer from UA after his release from Tartarus. Their hounding and threats against prominent international hero agencies that employed Izuku these past 5 years. This was their plan all along. It's why the commission didn't count the 5 years he was out of the country towards his probation. Shoyuta said with a shake of his head, his lips twisting and his jaw clenched as he spat the words out. If he didn't find that loophole, the only chance he'd get to be a hero would be as an agent under the direct control of the commission. Loophole? Midnight said, her voice broken with emotion as she looked at Nedu with a questioning look. What loophole? It seems young Midoriya has become an even greater strategist in his years away from our tutelage, Nedu said with a small smile, feeling pride in the young man's intelligence despite the situation they found themselves in. It's a law that hasn't been enforced in almost 100 years, but it allows himself the legal wiggle room to start his own hero agency without the express written consent of the commission. They can't be happy about that, Vlad said subduedly. Can't see them letting something like that go. The large man had almost been fired 5 years ago when it was discovered that several of his students had played a small role in leaking information regarding Izuku to the press. Of course, it had only been the Blood Hero's reaction to the event that had saved his position in Nezu's inner circle, but the small rodent would be lying if he said his opinion of the man hadn't changed over the whole event. The decision will of course be challenged in the courts, Nedu answered as he sipped a cup of tea. But until that day comes, young Midoriya will legally be a hero. As it should be. Nedu thought, his feelings about how the commission dealt with its business a well-known secret. One didn't have to look far to see the corruption in the industry after all, especially after everything that had happened these past few years. Where has he been these past few years? Present Mike asked, the voice he perfected for his radio show forgotten as he looked between the broken form of his friend and the still and petrified looks of the rest of the room's occupants. What's the little listener been doing? I'm afraid all I know about the boy I've heard from Yagi-san, Nedu said, his lips quivering at the thought of his last interaction with the former number 1 hero. We haven't spoken to one another for some time for obvious reasons. The room stilled again, the thoughts drifting to the events that led to all this happening. The first domino falling led them to where they all were now. The UA traitor investigation. Does anyone else know? Present Mike asked, his voice as quiet as a church mouse. Should we tell his classmates? Ex-classmates. Nedu answered his words feeling like daggers to those who heard him. I'm sure the former Class A will know all about this in the coming days. Do you think? Midnight asked, her voice failing her before she could finish her question. Nedu sipped his tea, not needing the woman to finish speaking to know just what she was referring to. Would the former members of Class 1A try to rekindle the relationship they had ended so many years ago? Some would, those whose guilt overrides the shame they held even after so many years. Some will. I am sure. Nedu answered the unspoken question by looking at the image of Shoto's face reflecting off the window. The man's stoic mask slips with each passing moment. Nedu hadn't seen the man look like that since Eri had demanded to know the truth about why she couldn't see Midoriya anymore. We will soon see whether their attempts will be a good thing. Hey, look, it's the consequences of my own actions. I really like suspected traitor AUs, but I actively hate a good portion of them. I usually have a list of things that I actively hate in fanfiction, and for some weird reason all of them just sort of show up in suspected tractor stories for some reason. Maybe they're all written by the same person, who knows. Unlike my previous story, The Green Man, this story isn't a glorified one-shot I just sort of slapped together because people liked it. It is an actual story that I purposely planned out from the beginning to its end. So get ready to get really sad. This will be a no-bashing zone. I try my hardest to keep characters as logically consistent as I can, and while I don't always succeed, I always make an effort. So if you've ever been turned off reading a suspected traitor story because the author has a vendetta against characters and write them like they were anime Hitler, this, my friend, is the story you need in your life. Also, unlike a lot of these types of stories, I'm not gonna try to romanticize suicide. It is a story where young adults deal with guilt and trauma in a respectful and hopefully mature way that makes you really understand what each character is going through. Or it might suck, who knows? Leave a review, favorite, or follow. My poor, sensitive ego can do little when it's not supplied with the right amount of attention. Katsuki Bakugo was not in the best of moods. Why wouldn't he be? For the 4th time this month, he had been on the wrong end of a bad blind date. You'd think the old hag that birthed him would have learned by now that he didn't want to be in a fucking relationship. Katsuki growled again. In his mother's infinite wisdom, she had decided that he was working too many long hours and needed to have some fun in his life, like she was some expert on the subject. Like he gave a shit about meeting new people, he already knew enough fucking people as is. He didn't need even more people he had to worry about. He walked through the busy city streets, the lights of clubs and restaurants illuminating the hustle and bustle of the late-night crowd wandering on their way to becoming properly drunk enough to start making terrible life decisions comfortably. Like the one he made when he agreed to the blind date his mom had set him up on. Of course, he did it more to shut his mom up for a few weeks than any desire to start dating, but he was willing to put some effort into the evening. He expected a pretty, if maybe a bit dull girl around his age, the type of woman his mother would call sweet, because she couldn't think of anything else to describe her. She'd be starstruck and insist on taking a selfie at least once every few minutes. But instead he'd nod and pretend to listen to her boring hobbies and feign interest in what she did for a living. He'd cover the bill because he wasn't an animal and pretend to get called in for a villain incident on the other side of town. Then of course he'd never see her again, but insisted he had an okay time whenever someone brought it up. The date of the evening, however, was fucking Satan incarnate. She was one of the models from his mother's agency. He'd been told a real firecracker, someone who reminded his mom a lot of him growing up. It was true mainly because Katsuki hated who he was when he was growing up. To the surprise of no one, the whole situation had been a shit show. All she did was talk, and yet Katsuki couldn't think of a single word that left the woman's mouth, and he tried to. Katsuki was just going to do what he usually did, if a little quicker than he usually did. But she had to keep getting worse. Who the hell starts berating their waitress over a bottle of wine the restaurant didn't have in stock? Like it was the waitress's fault his date couldn't get the exact 100,000 yen bottle of overpriced alcohol. The nervous young woman, who looked to be near tears by the time his date had started getting loud, was trying her best to do her job. "And stop with that creepy muttering," the woman had shouted, fully aware of the scene she was creating. "Maybe if you were halfway competent with your job, you wouldn't have to write every word down to remember the exact bottle I ordered." He could see the tabloid magazines now. Top 15 hero ground zero publicly berates model girlfriend in drunken argument. Even though he wasn't the one who started it, it was his date who had gotten them thrown out. Who treated a waitress like that for stuttering. So what if she needed a way to help remember complicated orders? She wasn't hurting anyone, was she? Katsuki sighed at the thought. Despite the shitshow his evening had become, Katsuki couldn't blame his mother for worrying about him. It wasn't like he was opposed to meeting someone. It was just... She laughed at his joke while trying to clean the ice cream that dripped onto her pink blouse. He didn't think it was a good joke, but hearing her laugh made Katsuki feel like he was on top of a mountain with the wind brushing his hair. She was still smiling as she looked at him with her big brown eyes, and all Katsuki could think about was just how soft and cute her lips looked to him. Katsuki reached down and pushed a brown curl out of her eyes, the girl's usually pink cheeks burning scarlet as she watched him lean down to her and capture her lips. Bakugo stopped dead in his tracks as the memories rushed back. He bit his lip to stop the sound from escaping his mouth because he knew it would sound like a sob. That was the last time he ever remembered feeling happy before the world he had built around him for more than 17 years crashed around him like a house of cards. Has it been 5 years since the last time Katsuki felt happy? But, of course it feels way longer than that, doesn't it? The last morning he woke up inside his bed without feeling like a complete and utter piece of shit? The last morning he wore his hero costume without being reminded of the horrible things he had done in his life. 5 years since she broke up with him. I'm so... The brown-haired girl stopped as she looked away from him. Her big brown eyes were already crying as her body was racked again by another sob. Why was this happening? I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore. It's about Deku, isn't it? He said. His voice was quiet and broken as the words felt like they evaporated by a sun that felt way too hot. Why was this happening? The day had started out so lovely. Not a cloud in the sky, and everything felt like it was going Katsuki's way. How could a few short hours change so much? Deku? Katsuki spat, the name sounding like needles as it left his throat. It doesn't change us. But it does. The girl looked at him, her eyes feeling like hunks of amber as she stood before him, dried tear marks down her face. It really does. Excuse me, sir. A voice broke Katsuki out of his thoughts, the pro-hero stunned by just how far he had walked while he was stuck in the past. This is a crime scene. Sure enough, the voice was right. Katsuki didn't notice the squad cars flashing lights nor the ambulance outside in the street. Dozens of onlookers stopped the night revelry as they watched the emergency workers do their work. The colored light of the neon lights of restaurants and clubs gave the scene an unreal quality, like it was a crime-themed section of an amusement park. How long had he been walking? Katsuki turned to stare at the police officer that spoke to him, seeing an unfamiliar face staring back at him. But, of course, a rookie would be the one to stop him. The one guy on the scene who would overlook a pro-fucking hero when he saw one. Relax, kid. Bakugo said, his voice like a growl of a wolf who hadn't quite decided if the rabbit in his vision was worth the hunt as he pulled his hero ID out of his pocket. I'm a hero. Oh, Mr. Ground Zero, sir? The rookie shot to attention, the freckles on his face burning his face in a scarlet blush. The green hair on his head made the young officer look like a living strawberry. I'm so sorry to bother you. I didn't recognize you. Katsuki ignored the younger man as he walked past him and towards the shattered glass that once belonged to one of those high-class hostess bars that had opened up in the area. Workers and patrons alike flooded the entranceway, some speaking to police. In contrast, others met with paramedics to deal with minor injuries. Still, most just watched as the chaos spilled over into the streets, like an audience watching a circus. Speaking of a circus, Katsuki said as he noticed that the media had already started to make their appearance on the scene, trying to find anyone who would speak to them about what had happened. Maybe Sparkles really was the smart one of their class after all. Dropping out of the hero course beginning of their third year was a shock at first, but at least he doesn't have to deal with news reporters running his support company. He could pay people to do that shit for him. Well, if it isn't Ground Zero, the aging detective said as he got off the police radio. It was a familiar face, at least one of the few cops in Katsuki's district that the explosion user actually got along with, if barely. I thought you had the night off. I'm here now. Katsuki spat, not wanting to be reminded of the garbage fire his love life had become. What seems to be the issue here? Attempted kidnapping, the old detective said, pointing towards a young woman with green skin and purple hair cut short. Never a dull moment these days, huh? Katsuki stared at the woman for a moment, noticing the bandages on her hand and head were a different color and brand than the ones used by the paramedics. This meant that whoever the hero was on the scene had prepared for and was at least somewhat familiar with first aid. There weren't many non-rescue heroes who prepared far ahead to interact with victims. Especially underground heroes who operated at night, preferring the more hit quick and get out even quicker approach to confrontations. To see someone who bucked the trend in such a way was interesting, to say the least. You don't say, Katsuki growled as he surveyed a group of uniformed police helping two paramedics lift a huge man into one of the awaiting squad vans. The man's rock-like body doing little to help the emergency workers' plight. Yeah, the big guy with two accomplices tried to strong-arm one of the workers here to come and party with them, the old man said as he took out a pack of cigarettes. She refused and things started to get a little messy. A place this fancy doesn't have security? Katsuki said as another pair of officers hefted another kidnapper off the ground. The man's hammerhead shark appearance contrasted with the pile of broken teeth that pooled under where he lay. Whoever had done this had indeed fucked these guys up. Not enough to deal with these three apparently, the detective said as he motioned towards the group's most petite man, the man's fox-like features clouded by his dual black eyes and swollen face. Turns out these guys run with a new crew. Locals say they're heavy hitters. Katsuki scoffed at the thought. There hadn't been anyone that could be called a heavy hitter, since All Might killed that all for one bastard 5 years ago. Ever since then, anyone more challenging than a purse snatcher or bank robber had taken to the shadows of society, operating underground with little to no interaction with one another. The days of a sweeping criminal organization pulling the strings of Japanese crime had long since died. Some say killed for good at the hands of the former symbol of peace in what would become All Might's final public appearance before his retirement. If these thugs were supposed to be someone special, then Katsuki certainly never heard of them. Still, he might have been too up on the food chain to notice whenever a group of small fries tried to start something big. But attempted kidnapping? In the middle of a massive crowd in the busiest hostess club in all of downtown? It took some balls. Maybe these guys were connected to that human trafficking ring that Shitty Hair had told him about last week. It was something to look into, at least. Anyway, the hero on the scene took them out before we arrived. Fast work. Katsuki said as he calculated the time it took for the hero to stop the crime and apprehend and contain 3 violent criminals. Then administer first aid all before the police arrived at the scene. More impressive considering Katsuki knew just how quick of a response this particular department was known for. Effective too. All 3 were bound, and the victim received first aid before he called it in. The man said with a smile, happy to avoid the headache of dealing with minor professional pro heroes in the area. If only every hero on the streets were this clean. It was one of the positives of working the graveyard shift, Katsuki supposed, not having to deal with rookie heroes or worse students on their internships and work studies. Who is it? No idea, the old detective said as he took another puff of his cigarette. All I know is that he's new and no one has ever heard of him before, but the witnesses say he's big, strong, and has a solid left hook. You didn't see him? Not a good look anyway. The old man responded. The fucker was fast. Katsuki growled again. It wasn't much to go on. He wasn't a fan of any new hero operating in his town without his say-so, but at the very least, whoever did this knew what they were doing. The same rookie officer who had stopped him before ran up to the old detective. Still, Katsuki wasn't paying much attention to them. He was too lost in thought as he surveyed the unfolding scene he had literally walked in on. He should get home, but he didn't want to deal with the headaches from soy sauce and shitty hair if he came home too early from his hot date. Or worse yet, if Raccoon Eyes was over to see shitty hair? Katsuki might as well put a bullet in his head right now to avoid that shit. He could at least grab a few hours of sleep at the office. Well, looks like you got yourself a chance at meeting the guy after all, the old detective said as he put out his cigarette. Got another call from a few blocks away. Our hero broke into a pachinko parlor and roughed up some employees. That sounded like something he'd expected from some bumbling thug, not the professional who did this. The confusion on Katsuki's face was noticeable as the old detective pulled out yet another cigarette. Turns out the parlor manager is the Hammerhead Shark's brother. The old man said, pointing to the handcuffed criminal Katsuki had noticed earlier. They also found 4 girls who were reported missing last night, handcuffed to a wall in the parlor's basement. Shit. So he interrogated the 3 criminals before he left. Not many heroes had the proper training to perform on-site interrogations, especially not ones as fast and effective as this one had to have been. Stopped a kidnapping and put down an entire trafficking ring in less than an hour. This guy works quick. As I said, fucker was fast. The old detective said as he watched the squad cars containing the 3 criminals pull away. Backup is already on the scene as we speak. Maybe you can even chat with the new guy on the block. You get a name? Dispatch said his name was Deku, the old man said with a laugh. What kind of hero name is that anyway? You know anyone like that? I'm not the traitor, Casey-chan. The voice from the cell sounded frail and tired, lack of sleep and hunger stripping the life and usual energy the voice usually held. They're lying. You have to tell All Might that. Please. Katsuki stood frozen. Like his limbs had forgotten how to move as his body grew numb with shock. His breath hitched, and only through sheer force of will did he not allow himself to fall over on his face. Deku had done this? It was a name he had thought about a lot these past years. Not a day went by when Katsuki's mind didn't wander to the boy whose life he had ruined. But it was the first time in a long time anyone had actually said the name out loud before. It sounded foreign to Katsuki's ears, like a curse word from a language he didn't understand but whose meaning he knew instantly. You okay there, Ground Zero? The old man said as he lowered his smoke from his mouth, apparent worry filling his eyes. Katsuki swallowed. The bile that threatened to leave his throat from the thoughts that raced through his mind. The mental image of deep green eyes burning into Katsuki's soul and making his skin crawl. I would never do something like this, Casey-chan. The teenager's scared voice broke through the cell's darkness. Don't you believe me? Hey, the old detective said, shaking the younger hero by his shoulder as forcefully as he could. Snap out of it, Ground Zero. Please, Casey-chan. The voice sounded even more broken as Katsuki walked away from the cell. Katsuki fully intended to never hear the voice that spoke out to him again. Don't leave me. Someone get me a medic, the old detective shouted, fear gripping his voice as he and 2 of his officers lowered the pro-hero to the ground. His skin was gaunt and white, and his eyes red, like the blood vessels in his eyes had become inflamed and exploded. We need help down here. This is what you deserve, Deku. Katsuki shouted, his voice twisted into murderous hatred that sounded almost demonic even to his own ears. For everything you did. He turned his back away from the imprisoned teenager, ignoring the weeps that followed the declaration. Instead, he smiled at the thought that the traitor was being punished for what he dared to do, what he would do to everyone else. Good riddance. He's going into shock. One of the paramedics screamed as Katsuki was placed into the ambulance, the rhythmic drips of drugs and oxygen mask doing little to settle the storm of emotions raging through him. "Ground Zero, sir, can you speak to me?" Katsuki's eyes stared off into nothing, tears spilling from his raw eyes as he relived the scene in his mind over and over again. "That's right, keep talking, sir," the paramedic spoke, her fear subsiding for a moment as her patient vocalized what sounded like a word, which was a good sign. "What are you trying to say?" "Deku," Katsuki said, his voice a sob as the drugs finally did their job, sending the pro-hero spiraling down into an unconscious heap. "I'm so sorry." This was the type of thing Tenya Ida, better known to his co-workers and the community at large as the Turbo Hero, Ingenium, hated the most about his day. Still, he knew this had to be done. Better to rip the bandage off quickly after all. The young speedster towered over the intern in front of him, making the head of the Team Ida 10 Hero Agency wonder if he was ever that small while still in school. The boy in front of him was short but stocky, with a build of a wrestler that played well with his ability to absorb kinetic energy from the movement of his body. Effectively, this quirk turned the hero student's body into a living cannonball. A unique quirk, to be sure, but how he used it had quickly become a problem. "Care to tell me what happened during your patrol last night?" Tenya bore down on the younger man. His voice carried little anger but more than enough disappointment to let whoever heard him know he was serious. "Sir." The teenager paused, looking somewhat confused for a moment as he readjusted his footing. "I captured the villain. He was... You went off on your own." Tenya cut him off, the tone of his voice enough to silence the younger teen. "You disregarded your senior's orders and decided to chase after the criminal instead of helping the injured civilians. That's what you did. But... And in your pursuit, almost caused a car accident and nearly killed the criminal you were chasing," Tenya said. He wasn't shouting, but that almost made the situation feel worse. Tenya had reread the arrest and hospital reports for everyone involved nearly a dozen times since the night before, memorizing every detail of the case. A gang of 3 well-known lowlifes, small-time crooks looking for a bigger-than-average score. With the added 15-year-old dropout, they had convinced to take part in the armed robbery that would be their shot into the big time. Everyone involved with the crime, the hero, police, or victims, agreed that the fourth and far less willing member of the 4-person crew was far less villainous than his partners. He was far more in over his head than his aggressive compatriots, freezing at the sight of violence while trying and failing to convince his partners to leave before something got out of hand. The fact that the boy even dropped his weapon to surrender when the pro-heroes arrived was also noted. But, with all that said, it was a surprise for Tenya to see that that boy was now in critical condition and by far the most injured of anyone involved with last night's escapades. "What was I supposed to do? Let the villain go?" The boy shouted back, gaining whatever courage he had left to speak up to his superior. What kind of hero lets a villain go when he can stop them? What kind of a hero brutalizes a quirkless teenager when he surrenders? Tenya said, flopping the tablet showing the security footage down on the desk. Likewise, what kind of hero ignores the potentially lethal car accident he caused to do so? The boy stilled for a moment, clearly surprised at the knowledge that what he did was caught on camera when he did it. It seemed the Hero Commission was doing a far less robust job with the country's hero ethics since the overhaul 5 years prior. The outcome was staring at him now with a dumbfounded look plastered on his face. A shattered orbital bone, internal bleeding, and a fractured skull. Tenya rattled the list of injuries off, his voice getting louder with each word. "So tell me, how does that amount of damage happen when dealing with an untrained and unarmed combatant? What happened to following the basic rules of conduct? You could have killed someone out there by both your actions and inactions last night," Tenya shouted, shocking the intern a bit if going by the young man's face. It was the first time he had seen the engine hero speak like that to anyone, let alone him. "Because of that, I am officially resending my internship offer to you, as well as sending in my recommendations to your school to remove you from the hero course." "You can't do this," the boy shouted, fear and anger morphing his face into something far less human than it was a moment ago. "Not over some quirkless." "That's enough." Tenya cut him off with a shout. Loud enough for Tenya to know that whoever was in the agency office was now fully aware of what was happening. "You're lucky no one died, so I don't have to report this to the police, but as far as I'm concerned, your career in this agency is done." "Look, I'm sorry," the teenager said, his anger subdued and replaced with fear and apprehension. "I made a mistake and I'm sorry for it. You have to believe me. You can't ruin my chances at being a pro because of a mistake." "I'm not ruining your life. If anything, I might be saving it," Tenya said, readjusting his glasses as he stared directly into the intern's eyes. You must learn that hero work isn't about capturing bad guys but protecting the innocent. Not everyone who breaks the laws is a villain, and not everyone who follows the rules is innocent. I understand, Sensei, Tenya said as he straightened his posture to see if there was even a possibility that what the commission had said was true. Good, Eraserhead said with his usual stern tone of voice. Tenya could tell his teacher took these accusations seriously, which meant there was more to them than even Tenya could imagine. I want you to be careful around Midoriya until we have enough evidence to make our move. Tenya paused as he remembered his friend standing over him. Izuku's raw power shielding Tenya from the hero killer stain just a few weeks prior. Some of him didn't believe that the same boy back then could do what he was accused of. But what if he was wrong? What kind of hero would Tenya be if he allowed his personal feelings to get in between justice? I understand, Sensei. Tenya watched as the intern left his office like a zombie, as if every ounce of energy and happiness had been drained from his body. It wasn't until Tenya drained his first glass of whiskey from the bottle he kept hidden at the bottom of his desk that he was imbruing his own thoughts and feelings onto others yet again. It wasn't until he poured yet another drink from the quickly emptying bottle that he realized that today would be much longer than he thought when he woke up that morning. A knock at his door took Tenya out of his thoughts, causing him to quickly down whatever remained in his glass and hid the evidence before he allowed someone to enter his office. Are you gonna let me in or not? A familiar voice filled the room, causing Tenya to move towards the door faster than he would typically. He knew the consequences of leaving his girlfriend locked out of his office for more than a moment. The coffee is getting cold. May Hatsum strolled into the room like she owned the place. Considering her position as a head support consultant for Team Ida 10 and her dating the owner, it was more or less accurate. Besides, no one openly told May she couldn't do anything once she decided to do it. So if she wanted to have a quick breakfast with her boyfriend before she isolated herself in her lab for the next day and a half, then that's what she was going to do. You didn't have to do that. Tenya started, grabbing the loose bags of food from his girlfriend's hands, already trying to take whatever burden from her hands the best he could. The doctor said. Oh, zip it, legs, May said with a smile as she sat down in front of Tenya's desk with a smile on her face and a hand resting on her stomach. I heard this enough from the doc already. Just think of it as a little mommy-daughter time. Despite her annoyance, it was the first thing people noticed about May these days. But the woman was 8 months pregnant, and despite her insistence to the contrary, everyone May ran into these days seemed to only care about one thing about her. Not her latest inventions but her growing stomach. Tenya figured that if May had to stop working on her latest prototype over someone asking about the baby one more time, the engineer would kill someone. What kind of random person asked strangers if they started lactating anyway? It was a shock for Tenya when he discovered May's pregnancy. Mainly because for his life, Tenya thought he took all the precautions he could regarding the private matters he and May had, but it seemed life had other plans. If someone had told him, he would have been the first in his class to have a child so soon after school. He would have called them a liar and then told them it was unbecoming to be talking about that thing on school grounds. But here he was now, a month away from being a father. Tenya said nothing as he watched his girlfriend and mother of his future child set up for their meal. She made room on the spotless and orderly desk for the omelets, and crisp slices of bacon and fish May must have prepared herself before making her way to his office. Tenya remembered when he and May first got together that the engineer could barely make a sandwich without burning something to the ground. But say what you will about the president of Hatsum Industries. When that woman set her mind to something, she didn't stop until she was the best at it. His mother had been ecstatic when the pink-haired woman had asked her for cooking lessons. Not a day had passed since then that his mother didn't ask him when he was going to get off his backside and ask May to marry him. So I'm guessing your intern didn't work out, huh? May said, cutting to the chase as was her habit. I told you before that you should have gone for an intern from UA. Every other school has kind of fallen off, you know? May of course was right. The two had had an animated discussion about Tenya's refusal to take an intern from his alma mater. Even years after his graduation, UA was still considered the best hero school in all of Japan. Despite everything that happened. I'm sorry, Midoriya. Tenya spoke, the tone of his voice emotionless and robotic as he stared down at his shorter classmate. But perhaps we could hang out together some other time. I've already made prior arrangements. It's fine, Ida, the green-haired boy said, trying to hide whatever disappointment he must have felt with a smile. It's just that everyone has been acting really strange these past few weeks. I just can't figure out why, you know. Tenya said nothing as he watched the boy turn away from him. It was harder than Tenya thought it would be, but it was something he knew had to be done to protect the rest of the class. They had all agreed to it, of course. Until more information could be gathered about Izuku's crimes, no one in Aizawa meant no one was allowed anywhere near Izuku without a faculty or commission agent nearby. A part of Tenya wished this didn't have to be the case, but that part felt smaller than it did at the beginning of the investigation. The more evidence became uncovered. Registered quirkless at age 4. No history of a quirk until the day of their entrance exam. A father whose entire identity was considered so off the grid, the more it seemed like the name Hisashi Midoriya was nothing more than an alias for a man who didn't want to be found. The raw power behind his quirk that seemed almost supernatural sometimes. Tenya bit his lip to stop himself from calling out to the boy as he disappeared into the crowd of faceless students. Despite knowing what he was doing was right, he couldn't help but feel a chill run up his spine as the words of his teachers and the Hero Commission representatives filled his ears. "You okay, Legs?" May asked, pausing to take another bite of her eggs as she looked at her boyfriend. "Did I oversalt the fish again?" "No, it is fine," Tenya said before shoving a piece of his breakfast into his mouth, swallowing it without even chewing to convince his girlfriend there was nothing wrong with her latest cooking attempt. "I just have a lot on my mind recently. You know, if something is bothering you, you can tell me, right?" May said in a quiet voice, sounding far smaller than someone like May Hatsum had the right to ever sound like. "So you don't have to stress out all by yourself, right?" "I know," Tenya responded, his eyes drifting away from the pink-haired woman. "It's nothing serious, I assure you. I just don't want you to stress more than you already do. With the baby." "Oh please," the support engineer said with a smirk as she placed a hand on her belly. "This baby is already a tough cookie. Just like her mama." Tenya smiled as he watched May smile, feeling his mood brighten slightly at the sight. May could always drag him out of a bad mood through sheer pig-headedness and willpower, an aspect of her personality that only seemed to grow as she got older. "But since that intern of yours is a no-go, I can always shoot a message to Power Loader if you want," May said as she cracked open an energy drink, the one brand of energy drink in the country that was deemed medically safe for pregnant women. "He owes me a couple of favors, and I'm sure there might be 1 or 2 first years not feeling their chosen internships." Tenya sighed again at the mention of his former school, but the fact was that UA might be the last place he wanted to look for a possible intern. Even after graduating years ago, the wound of UA still lingered, like a cut refusing to scab over. He felt for the scar on his shoulder, the mark left him by the hero killer stain back in his first year, feeling the long-since-healed injury burn under his clothing. It might have been far worse, he thought to himself, if it hadn't been for Izuku. Tenya paused from his meal, the name bouncing off of each corner of his head as he silently stared back to the desk drawer where he kept his liquor bottle hidden away. Truth be told, there hadn't been a day in the past 5 years where Tenya didn't think of Izuku Midoriya. He was his best friend after all. Was his best friend. "We don't have to talk about this now if you don't want to," May said, her voice sad as she looked down at her food plate, toying with a piece of green spinach she cooked into her eggs. "I know it's hard for you, but—" "Midoriya, please don't make this harder than it has to be," Tenya said, his voice slightly muffled from behind his hero uniform's metal face mask. "Listen to the heroes and surrender yourself before any of us do something we might regret. Speak for yourself," a voice called out from Tenya's side, a voice he couldn't place but knew he had heard before. "I'm just waiting for an excuse to put the traitor down." "Tenya, what's happening?" Izuku said as he repositioned his back against the wall. Whether out of fear or in an attempt to minimize the chances of someone sneaking up from behind him. "Just tell me what this is all about. Whatever this is about, we can fix this. The time for talking is over." Their teacher's voice spoke up from the crowd, his red eyes glaring onto the form of the now momentarily powerless hero student. "Just get on your knees and raise your hands over your head, or else we will have to treat you as an enemy combatant." Tenya watched as Izuku's eyes widened at the underground hero's words, looking towards anyone in the crowd in front of him for any semblance of emotion beyond anger and disgust. Ida watched as Izuku made a fist with his hands, green electricity radiating off his body despite their teacher's quirk being activated. A rumble moved throughout the assembled heroes and students. This had to have been the power of All for One. A power that not even Eraserhead's quirk could hope to suppress. No typical quirk had this type of raw power after all. No natural quirk anyway. "I'm sorry, Midoriya," Tenya said as his engine roared to life, his classmates and teachers readying beside him. "But you forced us to do this. If you want to talk about it." May answered as she placed her hand onto Tenya's own, forcing the taller man to look her in the eye as she stood over his seated form. "I'm more than willing to listen." Tenya sighed as he placed his hand into his girlfriend's, squeezing the woman's smaller hands as the thoughts in his head made the room swirl around him. 5 years had already passed, and even the memory of what he did was still enough to make him want to crawl into a dark room and drink until he was a blubbering mess on the floor. Tenya was going to answer her before his words were cut off by the ringing of his office phone. He usually didn't work Saturday mornings, only coming into the office this morning to handle the issue with his former intern. Unfortunately, it was also so early that the Team Ida 10 agency wasn't officially open. Only a few early birds who wanted to get some overtime pay at their desks. Tenya was willing to let the phone ring, deciding that whatever the reason wasn't as important as spending time with May. You might want to pick that up, May said as she cracked open yet another energy drink. It's gotta be important for someone to call before your office is open, right? Tenya couldn't fault the logic as he reached over to pick up the ringing phone off his desk, catching the familiar voice on the other end of the line by surprise. I'm telling you he's not, the voice said, speaking to another party in the background before he focused his attention back on Tenya when he heard the phone line connection. Oh shit, you are there. Hey Ida, it's me, Kirishima. Tenya felt his lips turn into a small smile as he listened to the golden retriever-like voice of the sturdy hero Red Riot. It had been a long time since the two had talked. Still, Kirishima was one of the few members of his former class. They operated closely enough to Tenya that the occasional team-up wasn't an impossibility. Or at least Kirishima was one of the few heroes from his former class who worked near Tenya that Tenya was willing to work with. Good morning, Red Riot, Tenya said in his practiced and professional tone of voice, ignoring the smirk on his girlfriend's face as he did so. What can I do for you? Katsuki, Kirishima said, his voice becoming a low whisper as he spoke like he was telling Tenya some grand secret. Something happened to him last night and he's in the hospital. Tenya stiffened as he listened to the redhead's words, squashing down the intense distaste Tenya felt for the explosive quirk user as he did so. It wasn't a secret that the two never got along well in school. Whatever relationship they could have had become unsalvageable by the time they graduated. The two barely spoke more than a few sentences to one another in the Class A reunions they attended these past 5 years. But whatever dislike Tenya felt for the man, Tenya wasn't the type to wish misery on anyone, especially a fellow hero. What happened? Here's the thing. I don't actually know. Kirishima's voice spoke up again, evident distress and confusion tinting each word out of his mouth. He says he's fine, but beyond that he's not saying much. So doctors are going to release him this afternoon. That's good, Tenya said, readjusting his glasses, a habit he formed whenever he thought he was waiting on bad news. Whatever injury he received isn't something to worry about. Katsuki wasn't injured by a villain. Kirishima's voice spoke back up, interrupting Tenya's line of thought with yet another surprise. He wasn't on patrol last night. The EMTs that brought him in said he just sort of started freaking out at a crime scene and was rushed to the nearest emergency room. That was certainly odd. Say what you wanted about Katsuki Bakugo. He wasn't the type to react in such an extreme manner for no reason. Whatever had been the cause of something like this had to have been serious. The doctors say he's fine, and the only thing Bakugo is saying beyond that to me is that he needs to tell everyone something vital. Kirishima paused, Tenya almost imagining the man turning his head to ensure no one was listening in before finishing. It's kind of freaking me out, to be honest. Let me guess. Katsuki asked you to call me because he wasn't sure I'd pick up the phone if it was him? Bingo, class president. Despite the situation, Kirishima still managed to find his sense of humor. Todoroki says he might be able to make an appearance as long as you were going. But Uraraka. I can't say I'm surprised, Tenya said, thinking of the last time the gravity and explosion user was in the same room as the other. The memory of brown eyes full of tears was enough to swear off another one of Mina's get-togethers for a while, or else he would put Nedu through a wall. I don't exactly know what Bakugo wants to talk about, but it might be for the best if we leave Ochako out of it right now. Yeah. The voice on the other line drifted off like Kirishima was thinking along the same line as Tenya was for a brief moment. So that might be for the best after all. The conversation paused for a moment, the same way every exchange broke for Tenya whenever he spoke with one of his former classmates, even for the ones he kept in contact with and still considered his close friends. However, the unspoken topic that seemed to weigh on everyone's minds seemingly came to the surface whenever one spoke to another. It was hard for Tenya to keep in touch with his former classmates. For a while, Tenya thought of them like a second family, an admission that only made him want to weep at what tore them all apart. Kirishima didn't have to say a word for Tenya to know the redhead was thinking about Izuku at that moment. God knew Tenya was. I'll see you soon, Kiri, Tenya said, ending the conversation before one of them broke their class's unspoken agreement. We should do something soon, something that doesn't involve villains and hospital visits. Yeah. Kirishima said awkwardly but honestly as the phone call ended. I'd like that. Tenya stood motionless for a few moments, just listening to the sound of his phone's dial tone as he hung up. For some reason, Tenya couldn't get over the strange feeling that filled his gut about what was about to happen, like a cow being led to slaughter. Well, that sounds ominous. May said with a small smile as she tried to ease the tension she saw growing on her boyfriend's face. Anything serious? Just a bad feeling. Tenya's answered honestly, seeing no reason to lie to his girlfriend. But, unfortunately, Bakugo is in the hospital. Oh shit. He's fine according to Kirishima anyway, Tenya said as he took a bite out of his thankfully still warm eggs before plating another piece of fried fish onto his plate. Apparently, he has something he wants to tell our old class. Hasn't he heard of texting? I guess he thinks it is serious enough that he wants to tell it all to our faces. Tenya said as she took a huge sip of his orange juice, downing the entirety of the bottle in a single gulp. It has been a while since we've all been in the same room. But they won't be all together, will they? A part of him wanted to call Ochako. The last thing he wanted to do was leave the woman out of the loop despite her distaste and growing aversion for her ex-boyfriend. But something stopped him. Whatever had happened, Ochako would find out eventually. That always seemed to be the case whenever a new detail appeared in one of their lives. Tenya just hoped that whatever Bakugo wanted to say was worth whatever drama would sprout from this. Mina stared at herself in the mirror. The sight of smeared concealer and running eyeliner staring back at her almost mockingly. She looked like an empty husk of her normal self, her usual bright pink skin sapped of its characteristic warmth and shade. When she had woken up a few hours before, she was a confident professional hero living her best life. Now, everything she had tried so hard to move on from had come crashing back on her. The tears and anxiety she had thought she had conquered came roaring back like the growls of gigantomachia that still caused her nightmares. The bangs and shouting from the outside world interrupted Mina's thoughts. At once, reminding the pink-skinned woman that she'd already spent more time away from her friends than she intended. She was a prominent pro-hero hiding in a public bathroom. At the same time, her friends and classmates were busy tearing themselves apart. Who was she trying to fool anyway? It wasn't like she was helping matters much. Although 5 years later, her class was still broken despite her best efforts. She could hide away in this bathroom and have no effect on the chaos erupting just a few meters away. What was she going to do? Smile and pretend she didn't die a little inside when she saw Ida stare at her with blank eyes? Keep an eye on Momo so she doesn't get any ideas and pop more of those anxiety pills than she should at once? Hold on to Kirishima and pray to whatever god still thought Mina was worth something that her boyfriend didn't fall into the same pit of despair he did back then? Her own sweet Kiri was almost lost to her forever, and here she was wallowing and feeling sorry for herself. No. She wasn't going to let that happen again. Deep breath. Mina said to herself as she plastered her best smile back onto her face, a smile that even she would admit looked strained and barely held together. Her reflection looked as broken and gutted as Mina felt, and not for the first time. The hallway was empty, the few nurses and hospital workers thankfully ignoring her as she made her way back to Katsuki's room. She was just glad Katsuki had lucked out and was taken to one of the few hospitals in the city that took hero privacy seriously. She remembered not fondly waking up from surgery during her second full year on the job. Having a bullet removed from her abdomen was not the best start for her day, but finding a mass of reporters waiting outside her room for hours was somehow worse. So who cared about her new line of swimwear when there were people who could have died? Nothing but a bunch of gossip hounds not caring about who they hurt as long as they get their exclusive. Is it true what they're saying about Midoriya's mom? Mina asked, her voice soft to not alert the rest of her classmates. The Midoriya subject was still raw for many Class 1A. If Mina could avoid ripping open the still healing wounds, she would. But she still had to know. Unfortunately, yes. Her teacher said solemnly, his eyes not betraying the disappointment in how a civilian had been dragged into public life because of the actions of her son. The commission has put a protection detail to ensure another incident doesn't happen again. But still? Midoriya's mom was innocent, right? There was no evidence conveying the Midoriya matriarch was anything beyond a loving mother who had the unfortunate luck of loving someone who didn't deserve it. So it wasn't her fault her son turned out to be a villain, right? So why would... Don't worry, Mina, this type of thing happens sometimes. Eraserhead said with a small smile, the first smile Mina remembered gracing the underground heroes' faces since Izuku's arrest a few weeks ago. Give it time and the vultures will find something else to report on. Just an average day for her after all. God, Mina hated reporters. Oh, you're back. A solemn voice broke Mina out of her thoughts as Shoji's colossal form met her vision when she turned the corner. I was afraid you left. You don't have to worry about that, Splatoon, Mina said, some pep returning for a moment to get her large friend to smile. Mina Ashido would never willingly leave without saying goodbye. The tentacled hero smiled, or at least the thin line of his lips curved upwards slightly, which she hoped counted as a smile considering the situation. What's going on in there? Mina said, trying to maintain the peppy energy she was known for. What's with all the noise? Shoji sighed as one of his extra arms pulled out yet another cigarette from the ever-quicking empty pack. The hand that held the cigarette pack lit it before morphing into another mouth before Shoji answered. Just Bakugo being Bakugo, Shoji said before taking a long drag of his cigarette, his colossal body almost shrinking as he exhaled the smoke. I just needed to get out of there for a second. Did anyone leave yet? Not that I saw. Shoji said with another drag of his cigarette, sighing as the smoke filled whatever number of lungs he formed inside his body. I don't think anyone is going to be leaving for a while. I know I won't be. Mina sighed as she turned to look to the closed door leading to Katsuki's room, the sounds of shouts mixing into a grumble of some great beast ready to swallow her whole once again. She felt her lips quiver again but held the sob back. Mina knew that if she started crying now, she wouldn't stop until her eyes burned from her acid. You going back in? You coming? I will in a minute, Shoji said as he lit another cigarette. Yet, another mouth formed below his face as he spoke, now joining the rest of his body and taking as much of the drug as Shoji could handle. It was a habit the tentacled hero formed whenever he was stressed, but not one where Mina knew exactly when he started. Just want to be alone for a bit. When did you start smoking anyway? Mina asked as she turned to open the door, prepping her ears for the chaos in her absence. About 5 years ago, Shoji said as he turned away from her, his mind already a million miles away from the hospital. Mina's appearance did nothing to diffuse the tension as her former classmates ignored her, their eyes glued onto the unfolding scene in front of her. Then why don't you do something about it? Katsuki said, taking a step closer to Kaminari, the electricity hero's eyes wide in shock and dismay as his friend did so. If you have a problem with what I said to him, why don't you make me stop? Katsuki was out of bed, his hospital scrubs replaced with the dress shirt and slacks he had worn the night before. He looked out of place with the hero uniforms and casual weekend wear of the people around him. It would have been almost funny to see it any other day, but today it felt hollow. That's enough, Bakugo, Kirishima said, getting between the forms of his fighting friends. Still, Mina could see the underlying sense of dread fill his body. Despite what Kiri would admit out loud, he expected violence to happen if the telltale sign of his cracking and jagged forearms meant anything. No, let him say what he wants to say. Ida responded, the X-class president looking at his hot-headed compatriot with disdain. Go on, Katsuki. Why don't you tell me exactly why I should have invited Ochako? So she can hear from a guy she wants nothing to do with telling her that Midoriya? The name was enough to make Mina recoil slightly, like someone had slapped her face as the world around her slowed to a crawl. Her mind raced to and fro, trying to find anything that could cut through the awkward situation. But unfortunately she found no port in the storm, no lifeline to grab onto. No lighthouse to signal safe passage as wave after wave of regret and self-loathing dragged her and her friends further down into misery. Momo was still crying. She had been the first of the assembled group to do it, but she was far from the only one. She leaned heavily into her boyfriend's shoulder, the half-and-half number 12 hero looking almost frozen solid as he numbly held onto her. Mina feared that if Momo hadn't been there with him, Shoto would have joined Ida for whatever Katsuki had said to set the taller man off. Kaminari was held back by Sero and Ojiro, the tape user trying desperately to keep Kaminari out of whatever physical altercation was about to unfold between Ida and Katsuki. All the while, Sato and Kirishima, their faces twisted into masks of strained emotionless compliance, stayed close to Katsuki. Kiri's hands hovered over his best friend's shoulder to rein in Katsuki's worst tendencies when he was angry or sad. Jiro was just staring off into nothing. Her eyes were glossy from unshed tears, but she looked more numb and emotionless than they did anything else. Jiro had never entirely confided with Mina about the Izuku situation, but if the music she had written these past 5 years meant anything to go by, then well, the fact that the punk rocker had just shut down emotionally when the news hit shouldn't surprise Mina too much. Like a black hole had eaten every semblance of happiness that used to be in her life. Toro had folded into herself, holding her knees to her face as she tried to make herself look as small as she must have felt she was. Besides Kiri, Mina had known Toro the longest out of all the people in the room. Despite her invisible features, Mina could read the girl like a book. The girl was just about a few moments away from a panic attack, one Mina knew from experience would rage through the day if left unchecked. Mina moved across the room and wrapped her arm around the floating blouse, trying desperately to hug the panic attack away before it fully arrived. Sue, bless her heart, leaned heavily into her boyfriend's shoulder as she wept, crying harder than Mina could remember the frog girl ever crying before. Tokoyami's quirk wrapped itself around the frog girl like a blanket as its master tried and failed to control his emotions. Chaco. Wasn't there something Mina was upset over at first? She had as much of a right to hear this as everyone else here, even more so if Mina was honest, but now she was internally grateful for it. Sue, Ida, and Shoto would need to be the ones to tell her about this. Katsuki lost the right to be the bearer of her terrible news long ago. If only Mina had kept her stupid mouth shut all those years ago. I'm telling you guys, Mina whispered to her classmates. Her room allowed her some level of privacy but not enough for her to speak her mind as comfortably as she might have wanted. Ochako hasn't left her room for days. Can you blame her? Jiro said as she fiddled with her ear jack. The bruised and battered punk rocker looked worse for wear despite the ordeal they had gone through with the former member of their class. Her best friend betrayed the school and was working with the people who wanted us dead. It was true. It may have been a tough pill to swallow that Midoriya had been secretly feeding their mortal enemies all of their secrets and had plotted to kill them multiple times. But it was one they needed to quickly get used to before they could even hope to move on. It would do no one any good anymore after all. I know that. Mina said defensively as she rubbed the side of her arm, the same one the traitor had wrapped one of those creepy black tendrils over in his escape attempt. She was lucky he hadn't ripped it off. But that doesn't mean we can sit here and let her wallow with a broken heart. What do you suggest then? Sue asked, her ordinarily emotionless eyes telling Mina that while the frog girl wasn't entirely on board with what Mina was planning, she'd be willing to try anything to make Ochako a semblance of how she used to be. Mina smiled as she saw the other girls slowly agreeing with her. After all, the best way to get over heartbreak was to find someone else, or at least that's what those teen dramas always said, and Mina had the perfect guy for the job. Shut your mouth, Four Eyes. Katsuki growled, small explosions erupting between his fingers like a not-so-hidden threat. Or something terrible is going to happen to you. No, you're so right. Tenya said, taking a step back and lifting his arms upwards, almost daring Katsuki to throw the first punch. It's not the great Katsuki Bakugo who was the first guy who started shit-talking Midoriya at the beginning of our first year. It was all Hitoshi's fault. Mia felt sick the more she thought of it. Had this been what they were arguing over? The person who took Midori's spot in their class. How was he handling all this? Mina turned her head, looking to and fro for the underground hero who was here before she had run out of the room, finding only an open window indicating where the boy had left from. Kaminari? Mina said, trying to de-escalate the situation before it got any worse. Katsuki's hand glowed brighter with each word he heard. Why don't you? No, because Katsuki over here can never ever admit when he fucks up. It's gotta be everyone else's fault. Kaminari shouted, breaking himself free from Sero's grip as he turned back to the scowling face of Katsuki. It's not like he fucked up like the rest of us. Because Katsuki fucking Bakugo is too damn smart. Ain't Flux could kill. You wanna go too, Sparky? Katsuki said. His eyes had a dangerous glint to them even more than usual. Katsuki had always been a bit of a hothead. It was a part of his charm after all. But this? Let me guess. Kaminari said as he looked Katsuki square in the eye. It's all Shinso's fault Ochako dumped your ass too? The sound of flesh and bone hitting flesh and bone filled Mina's ears. She could do nothing but watch as Katsuki delivered a punch to Kaminari's jaw, knocking the electric quirk user to the ground. You shut your mouth. Katsuki screamed as Sato and Kirishima dragged the enraged explosion user away from the downed Kaminari. The two muscular and powerful young men struggled to suppress Katsuki as he struggled and fought with everything his body could produce. You shut your stupid fucking mouth, you dumb piece of fucking shit. Fuck you, you fucking asshole. Kaminari shouted back, the lower half of his face already swelling as he was held back from retaliating by Tokoyomi and what looked to be a crying dark shadow. Knock it off. Mina shouted, tears running down her face as she tried to stop the chaos from getting more out of hand. How could things have gotten so bad? She had only been gone for a few minutes and everything just escalated. Please, just stop. The tears Mina had fought so long to control broke free as her whole body rocked with her sobs. So here she was, a grown woman and professional hero, just ugly crying in front of her friends because she was too weak to keep her emotions in check. I'm a disgrace. Mina said to herself, remembering the words her childhood bullies would say to her growing up. About how she was too dumb and emotional to do anything right, let alone be a pro-hero. I'm a fucking disgrace. She felt arms around her body and mine didn't need to. Open her eyes to know that Kiri was holding on to her, his skin hardening to avoid the burns her tears would create. For a moment they just stood there, and for a moment, Mina didn't care about anything else happening. She didn't care about Katsuki's anger. She didn't care about her friends trying to kill one another. All she wanted was for things to return to the way things used to be. Was that too much to ask? I'm sorry, Kaminari, Katsuki said, whatever anger filled his voice, leaving him as he slunk back to his bed. I'm sorry. Kaminari didn't say anything back, but his eyes never left Katsuki's. For a moment, Mina feared that the tentative peace would be broken again. But Kamari, like many times before her, had surprised her. I'm not the one you owe an apology to, Bakugo. His voice was solid but pained, like the words he spoke were made of lead. You know Shinso still blames himself. We all do. Not like Shinso, Tsu said, her voice cracking as she spoke. Tsu had always been blunt, but Mina felt like the frog girl's words felt like a hammer to the back of her head at the moment. None of us are the guy who took Izuku's spot in our class. The room stilled, so quiet Mina hadn't realized Shoji had re-entered the room to quietly wrap an arm around a far too quiet Kota. Mina looked at Shota, the shame on his face almost making her want to cry again as she tried to calm herself down. Everyone in the room remembered the words they had said to Shinso to make him feel welcome in their class the day he arrived. The terrible things they had all said or thought of Izuku to make sure now feel comfortable were still enough to make Mina feel her skin crawl when she thought of them. But for Shinso? To have Izuku Midoriya, of all people, hang over your head? To have all the baggage of seeing yourself as the one who took everything from the betrayed boy? The same boy who was the first person in Shinso's life to believe in his dream? Mina didn't want to think about it. It was no surprise that Shinso had tried to drop out of the hero course. Her entire class, only a few weeks from the end of their second year of school, had already been indicated with threats of withdrawal. Mina already had half her room packed by the time Miss Midnight had sat her down to convince her otherwise. Mina knew she wasn't the only one who wanted to drop out. To admit that she had lost whatever right she used to call herself a hero long ago. Even now, she found herself, more often than not, keeping Kiri from announcing an early retirement whenever his demons got the better of him. In the end, only Yuga made the gut-wrenching decision to leave the class, the blonde tearfully proclaiming that he had lost his sparkle over the whole ordeal. Someone's gotta have to tell Aoyama about this, Mina said as she wiped the tears from her eyes and blew back the unfortunate amount of acid that left her nose. He has that fashion show in Paris this week and deserves to know. I'll tell him, Momo said as she stood up. Her face was red and puffy, and for the first time in her life didn't look like the unstoppable big sis she was to the rest of the girls in their class. I'll video call him when he has a free moment. Mina almost forgot that Momo and Aoyama had gone into business together after her graduation. The two used both of their family influence to get a head start for not just their careers but the careers of the rest of their class. Except Midori. Who's gonna tell my Netta? Sero said from his spot, scratching his cheek as he looked at the group in front of him. The dude is still not back from his honeymoon yet. I don't want to ruin that for him. Oh God, had it only been a week since my Netta got married? It seemed so long ago, thinking about all of her friends' smiling faces celebrating together. They had been so happy together, putting aside their issues to come together after so long apart. Laughing, drinking, taking pictures, and just not what they were doing right now. Let him enjoy the honeymoon first, Ida responded, readjusting his glasses as he slowly calmed down from the beat Katsuki within an inch of his life soapbox he had been standing these past few minutes. We can tell him when he gets back and gets settled. What about Shinso? Kota said, his quiet voice hoarse and strained as he spoke. How? Don't worry, Kota, Kaminari said with a small smile that didn't seem as strained as the ones Mina tried to keep on her face. He just needs some time alone, but I'll talk to him and make sure no one here blames him for what happened more than we blame ourselves. And Ochako? You leave her to me, Ida said. If he saw the look on Katsuki's face when he said it, he didn't show it. Even though Mina was thankful not to see Ochako's reaction to this news. The fact that the gravity user would be one of the last people to know the truth hurt Mina deep in her soul. Ochako had been too good of a friend and person to deserve this, yet. Mina looked around the assembled group in front of her. Their broken faces stared back at her like a mockery of real people, like seeing strangers wearing Halloween costumes of all her friends. She squeezed Kirishima tighter to herself. The only thing going through her mind was the desire to go home and sleep the misery away. Mina stared at the scene before her with shocked eyes as the traitor gripped his hand against Shoto's throat. The son of the number 2 hero stared up at the green-haired boy with hatred radiating from his two-colored eyes. Even without numbering him in all their planning and backup, the traitors still defeated them. Mina rolled over to her side, the dust and debris hiding the form of their attacker from her view. Whatever doubt was in her heart was gone once she saw the insane and unnatural power of Midoriya's quirk. Enough that not even the combined force of UA and the Hero Commission forces could contend with. If All Might was here. But he wasn't here. The number 1 hero had left weeks before, trying to hunt down the man who had given Midoriya his quirk. To put a final nail into the villain's criminal empire and end all the pain and misery that had seemingly followed them all year. They thought they could do this without All Might's help, to be real heroes and stand up for what was right. The combined strength of UA should have been enough. If it had been anyone else, it would have been, but the traitor had studied their tactics, moves, and quirks until he knew them as well as they did themselves. And Shoto was about to pay the ultimate price for their hubris. I didn't want to do this, the traitor shouted, the green arcs of electricity glowing through the dust like the semblance of a demon. Why are you making me do this to you? Was he blaming them? Like he wasn't the reason all this was happening? It made Mina sick to think that she had once considered that boy her friend. That she had once considered him good enough for Ochako. The same boy who had played a part in the attack on the USJ. The crippling of their teacher. The attack at the summer camp. The attempted murder of all of her friends and Katsuki's abduction. Even after everything he had done, he still dared to pretend he was a victim? Katsuki was right about him all along. You know what you did. Shoto spat, glaring at the boy she considered his first real friend. The love he held for the boy morphed into hatred at the monster the boy secretly was. All this is because of you. Don't try and hide it. The traitor said nothing as he stared at Shoto. His eyes radiating with an emotion that Mina had never seen before. Like his heart was breaking with each word Shoto said to him. Please Deku. A voice that sounded like Ochako said from within the darkness, pain and desperation dripping from her voice as she spoke. You've hurt too many people already. You have to stop this before you make it worse. Despite the dust and smoke disappearing, Mina couldn't see where Ochako was, but she could tell she was close. If she could distract the traitor for just a bit longer? Ochako? The boy turned to his former friend, his eyes betraying none of the malice he held in his body as he stared at the girl. I have no idea what you're talking about. Just tell me what this is about. Young Midoriya, a booming voice broke through the chaos, making Mina's heart almost beat out of her chest. It was him. Put the boy down and face me. All Might. The traitor spoke, confusion and relief filling his voice in equal measure as he turned to where the voice came from. A sick smile crossed the traitor's face before his body became stiff and rigid. Looks like your reign of terror is over, traitor. Shinso said with a weak smile, his body closed to exhaustion as he dragged his body across the ground. Now go to sleep. Izuku obeyed the general study student's words. The boy's green eyes closed before he hit the shattered pavement, dropping the still-injured Shoto to the ground as he did so. But as the cries of celebration and cheers filled the halls of their school when the police arrived to take Izuku into custody, Mina couldn't get the sight out of her head. Why had Izuku sounded so hopeful that All Might had returned? What had he been planning for the symbol of peace? What exactly was he going to do? Mina hugged his head deeper into Kirishima's shoulder, crying even harder than she did a moment ago. It had been so wrong. They had been so wrong about everything. Why was she so stupid? Why didn't she try to understand what was happening and why Izuku kept his secrets from them? Why did she have to react the way that she did? And how could she make it better? But as the thoughts of how she could fix what she had broken died in her head, only the numbness of her mistakes remained. She just wanted Kirishima to keep holding her until the world started returning to normal. Back when the world made sense and Mina could look at herself in the mirror and not cringe when she saw her reflection. Still, she feared any chance of that happening was as dead as she felt inside at this very moment. Nedu did not want to be here. In fact, out of all the places he could spend his Sunday morning in, the office of the Hero Commission president had to be one of the last in the long list of locations. Right between Tartarus and being locked back in a cage at the unnamed government laboratory he had been forced to call home for far too many years. Principal Nedu, the president smiled, the practiced gesture looking almost natural on the woman's face as she stared down at him. What a pleasure. What can I do for you this fine day? You know why I'm here, the white-furred educator said, his voice curt as he stared at the woman before him with disgust and pity. So let's not fool ourselves into thinking this will be a pleasant conversation. The woman smiled again and not for the first time. Nezu was reminded that humans indeed were a despicable species. Although, of course, the woman before him was intelligent in her own way, far too wise to hope to play dumb with him convincingly. But still, here she was, staring him down like she was some sort of innocent bystander instead of the would-be power broker she was trying to be. Especially one who had just relighted a bomb she was lucky hadn't blown up in her face the last time she tempted fate. "I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about." The woman persisted, as a child who was caught with her hand in the cookie jar would, proclaiming her innocence with crumbs on her face. "Would you like some tea? You seem to be in one of your poor moods this morn." The slam of the tablet onto her desk cut her off, Nezu's small black eyes savoring the shock and fear that crossed the woman's face for a brief moment. "Where did you get this?" Her voice hissed like a viper, a sound that made the fur on Nezu's back stand up out of some misplaced instinct. "This is confidential information and I'm afraid you will be hard-pressed to know exactly who leaked this information," Nezu responded with a smile. "After all, half of this nation's top 10 are alumni of my school, and quite a bit more of them are as disappointed as I am about this type of response. Ordering the most senior heroes in the country to remain silent under legal penalties isn't likely to be viewed very favorably." "I see," she answered, her tone dropping the fake friendliness she spoke with as she rubbed her palms together in aggravation and annoyance. "I honestly didn't expect you, of all people, to care about him after all these years. Once a student, always a student," Nezu said, his voice sounding far more akin to his animal genetics than it did in years. "However, the question remains, why did you open wounds that should have never been made at all?" The president took the electronic device into her hands, pretending to read the confidential message sent to every hero in the top 10 rankings regarding Izuku Midoriya with a calculating eye. But, of course, it was a ruse, a show for his benefit that she must have been foolish enough to think would convince him of her innocence in the matter. But they both knew that wasn't the case. "Mr. Midoriya hasn't been a hero for a full 2 days yet," the hybrid genius said as he stared intently at the human in front of him. "And you already sent out an internal memo for all top 10 ranked heroes to stay clear of him and warned half of the police departments in the country to be wary of him. No need to be dramatic." The president spoke, her tone detached from the situation as she stared at the educator with emotionless eyes. "The man can return to his hero work as soon as he agrees to the commission's demands. I'm afraid that indentured servitude is a bit more than simple demands," Nezu said, taking pleasure in the twitch of the woman's eyes when he said the word. "Take from me that this particular request will fly over extremely poorly if it's made public." "Are you threatening me?" The woman sounded offended, enough to make Nezu almost want to smile out of sheer spite. "So you come to my office thinking I'm like one of your teachers?" "I assure you that my teachers, however disappointing their decisions may be," Nezu responded instantly, cutting the woman off. The venom in the president's words made him want to bare his fangs. "Happen to learn from their mistakes." "Denied," Nezu said, his voice harsh as he tore up the resignation letter in his hands, staring at the assembled heroes in his office. "You think you can walk away after what you did? Try and make things better by running away from your responsibilities?" "It's not that," Eraserhead said, his voice broken as he stared down at Nezu. The lack of sleep and mental exhaustion made the man look more like a corpse than a man. "I have no right to teach the next generation of heroes, let alone the students I forced into this mess." "No, you don't," Nezu responded, his words like a punch to the gut for the same people he once thought of as family. "But you should have thought of that before you got the children involved. Now you have a year to fix what you broke, so I suggest you stop feeling sorry for yourself and start doing your job." "If you're referring to Lady Nagant and Hawks," the woman said evenly as if trying to rein her anger with each word, "my people are still working on the situation, and they will be apprehended relatively soon. If you think that is what I'm worried about, then you are more of a lost cause than I originally thought," Nezu said as he closed his eyes and let a deep sigh fill his lungs. "Every known instance of the commission trying to have a hero do its dirty work has led to misery for all involved, especially for the heroes under your thumb." "Your point?" "My point is that Mr. Midoriya has already suffered enough due to the mistakes and failures of those he trusted," Nezu responded, his voice more like a growl with each word. "Instead of trying to give that man an olive branch to make up for your past actions, you decided to double down. This organization and those in its employ have decided to return to what it started 6 years ago by smearing an innocent man." "We don't know if he's innocent," the woman responded, but they both knew that was a lie. "We simply couldn't find any evidence of his guilt. That's a fundamental difference." "All for one admitted it," Nezu said, leaning forward on his chair, ignoring the woman's motion towards her silent panic button she kept under her desk. He admitted to it on live television. Dozens of lie-detecting quirks agreed that the man told no lies about Izuku Midoriya. And we both know it. Nedu thought of the emotionally broken form of the former #1 hero. The giant of a man screamed, his voice raw as he smashed his colossal fist against the red paste that was once the head of his former archenemy. As he met his end, the man's mocking laughter was enough for Nezu to want a shower whenever he remembered it, the words keeping him up at night 5 years later. "Say it," All Might roared. His voice was as raw, and his anger was blinding as he stared down at the broken body of his defeated enemy. "Admit that my boy is innocent." The huge bloody fist of All Might hung high in the air like a meat tenderizer preparing a cheap cut of beef. The war had been brief but violent, with the city of Tokyo entirely destroyed by the onslaught the two titans had unleashed. "Izuku Midoriya!" All Might shouted, ignoring the man's cruel smile and taunting laughter as he lifted his bloody and scarred face off the ground by the once pristine color of his black suit. "I don't want to hear another word out of your mouth that's not about my boy. You all did such a wonderful job," the monster had said triumphantly through broken teeth and a shattered jaw as he stared unblinkingly at the #1 hero. "I must thank your lovely associates for gift-wrapping me that boy." Nezu remembered he was in his office when he heard those words, trying desperately to spearhead the defense effort. His office became the unofficial headquarters of the heroes during the closest the world had come to a new world war. But despite the chaos around him, Nezu stared unblinkingly at the video stream in front of him. So transfixed by the image of the Dark Emperor's broken body that the whole world around him felt cloudy and out of focus. He couldn't help but be memorized by the screens in front of him, the same thing playing on every channel and from every possible angle. He doubted there wasn't a single person alive on this planet who hadn't seen the video clip at least once. Like I needed to have a mole inside of UA to further my plans. All for one said with a smile, his mouth like an open and jagged wound, spitting blood and venom with each word passing his lips. "But when I heard that your student was the one being accused, well, it was an opportunity that was too good to pass up." The air stilled. Like the atmosphere around the two was burning and sizzling. It felt harder to breathe, and even though Nezu was miles away, he could feel the tension causing the fur on the back of his neck to stand up. All Might stared down at the defeated form of his lifelong enemy, his face a mask of pure hatred and disgust. The image may have been scrubbed from the internet, but Nezu would never forget it for the rest of his life. That moment All Might was no longer the symbol of peace but death incarnate. "You thought you could take my apprentice from me?" the villain spoke, coughing up thick globs of blood between each word. "Arrest him and throw away the key and I wouldn't have a backup plan. I wouldn't have a second candidate for my apprenticeship." Nezu's eyes widened at the thought of what an entire year in the lowest depths of Tartarus could do to a child. What being abandoned by those he called friends and allies would do to anyone. Nezu was aware of just what All for One did to prime and prepare Shigaraki to become the next symbol of evil. Just what was he planning to do to young Midoriya? This society is tearing itself apart, turning on one another after just a couple of threads get pulled. All for One laughed as if the past year had been nothing more than a joke to him. "All your sacrifice, and all the blood you spilled, and what do you have to show for it?" Nezu imagined what the faces of his staff and students must look like as they heard the words being spoken, as he fought the horror and bile from escaping his mouth, so tainted by the knowledge that they threw an innocent boy into the fires of hell. "That boy wasn't mine, but he soon will be." All for One laughed once more, his once brilliant criminal mind deteriorating from the assured brain damage his injuries had granted him. "And it's all your fault." The camera feed cut off at that moment. Still, all of Japan knew what had happened. The earthquakes that ripped through the country that day lasted for minutes, seemingly shifting the foundations of the world itself before they stopped. All that was left of the most feared villain the world had ever known was a pile of bloodied meat and powdered bone. All that was left of the symbol of peace that day was a broken husk of a man. One too injured and ashamed for what he allowed to happen to spend another moment as a hero. "The only thing we know is that All for One had plans for Mr. Midoriya." The president spoke, her voice somewhat under control now as she looked towards the furry principal with a languid glance. "What those plans are we can't possibly know. You spent an entire year interrogating him for information and received nothing in return." Nezu rebutted, his tone showing he had grown tired of the drawn-out conversation. The only thing keeping him invested now was the anger and disdain for the woman in front of him. No evidence of his guilt and more evidence of his innocence mounted by the day. A confession that was beaten out of a man is not legally binding. The woman countered, her eyes shifting to the door leading to her office. waiting for one of the enormous personal bodyguards she kept on staff to barge in and end the verbal spar she was losing. All Might was lucky he wasn't charged for what he did. You mean stopping a madman who had operated under your noses for decades? Nedu responded, actually finding it funny in retrospect how few in the hero community looked towards All Might for wisdom when the truth of All for One came to light. As if the symbol of peace wasn't spending decades hunting down and eradicating the remnants of the villain Shadow Empire for decades. How would the public have reacted to that? All Might almost single-handedly ending the war against the Paranormal Liberation Army and then gets arrested on live TV. Hero society almost crumples and you make jokes. The president said again, her face showing she was pushing the button under her desk harder now. All Might was willing to throw away all he built and for what? A boy he left to wallow in tartus for a year? Nedu bit back the primal desire to use his claws and fangs to rip and tear into the president's flesh, his intelligence winning out, if only barely. Even after so many years, Nedu still blamed himself for inadvertently setting up the environment for all this to happen. Things had changed after the capture of Shigaraki at the Kamino raid. The knowledge that All for One was not only alive and had been pulling the strings of the League of Villains the whole time but was still out there dominated Nedu's thoughts. All Might agreed, knowing he would be the only one who stood a chance at defeating an almost fully healed All for One and had promised he would hunt down the villain for as long as it took. The days morphed into one another, with weeks morphing into months before anyone truly realized what had happened. Nedu knew the reports of his temporary replacement were hiding something. He should have looked further into it. Still, the search for All for One was too crucial for him to allow distractions. What a fool he had been. A year of hunting and searching, war and raids, and non-stop violence had led to nothing before All Might was forced to return to Japan. But, in their absence, the war had already been taken to their front door. You insult the man who saved the country in the same breath you try to justify your actions. Nedu responded, his opinions of not just the woman in front of him decreasing by the second, but his view of the species in general. You should learn to keep that mouth shut, or you will not like the outcome. Is that a threat? No, Nedu said simply, the mental image of All Might returning to this office and treating this woman the same way he treated her predecessor all those years ago. His own faculty would attest that there was nothing like seeing an enraged All Might to make you question your past life choices. It's a promise. Perhaps we can tone down the aggressive language, the president said as she leaned forward, trying and failing to use her size advantage to take control of the conversation. It would be a shame for UA to lose such a valued and experienced face in these troubling times. Nedu paused, reading between the lines of the woman's statement and not liking what he saw. He didn't want to do this, but this seemed to be the only way for him to remain on the offensive. All I need to do is make one phone call, Nedu said, his paw sticking one digit into the air as he spoke, and All Might will break his silence about everything he has so politely kept under wraps this whole time. The effect was instantaneous, the smugness leaving the woman's face when Nedu brought up the name of the symbol of peace. A character that was so prominent and respected that no one, not even the entirety of the Hero Commission with all its power and influence, could hope to silence. We both know you had been watching young Midoriya for some time before the allegations spread around. It was mandatory as the governing body for all of Japan's hero schools after all, for the commission to have access to the video stream of UA's entrance exam. So you looked into that boy's past for anything you could use to bind him to you. We found credible evidence of the boy's less than honest nature, the woman said, leaning down on her desk. Your own faculty and student body agreed with us back then. We followed the proper guidelines. Is that what we are calling it now? Nedu said, cringing at the thought of Inko Midoriya, the woman being forced to leave the country to avoid the harassment she was facing. The poor woman was willing to stand up to death threats and the army of stalking reporters looking for blood. Still, the moment her apartment had been firebombed was enough to convince the housewife to decide that Japan was no longer safe. I had no idea that what happened to Inko Midoriya was considered the proper way to do things. That was an unfortunate mishandling of sensitive information. The president had the courtesy to look somewhat ashamed at the moment. Still, for Nedu it wasn't enough. If I could go back in time. Save it for someone who cares, the small principal said as he stood up from his chair to leave. I fear I've wasted my time in coming here. Nedu turned to walk away, not knowing the last time he had felt so much disgust for the concept of humanity. 5 or 6 years ago if he had to guess. I'm sorry that you've had to come all the way down here. I'm sure you're a busy man after all. Nedu could hear the sarcasm in the woman's voice but chose not to lower himself to the party insults of his enemies. Rest assured, the commission and I only have what's best for our heroes and Mr. Midoriya in mind. So you don't plan on making Izuku's return to Japan a public matter? Nezu said, savoring the woman's face dropping as he spoke. Did she really think he had no idea what they were planning? If you want to destroy whatever credibility you have left with the heroes of this country, be my guest. It will not go well for you when this is all over. I'm trying to protect our way of life, the president shouted, standing up from her seat as Nezu put his paw on the door handle. If you can't see that, then I doubt we were on the same side. If hero society was that close to being toppled over because of the truth, it deserved to be toppled over. Nezu said simply, his small black eyes looking more inhuman than they did a moment ago. I will not let you throw this man under the bus again to satisfy whatever greater good you are fighting for. He opened the door, allowing the president to see the members of her security detail she had not so secretly called during their meeting. The reason for their late arrival became apparent as they stood awkwardly in front of a young man who both Nezu and the president knew very well. The man was tall and muscular, his red cape recognizable as the flames of Endeavor or the bunny ears of Mirko. But for once, the trademark smile on the young man's face was absent. Instead, he stared challengingly at the men before him, almost daring any one of them to try and get past him. Lemillion, the number 2 hero in the country and the youngest man to ever hold the title, stared unblinkingly at the suited men. The president, now knowing who leaked her memo and that whatever she thought of how her meeting with Nezu had gone, the scolding she would receive from Mirio would be far worse. I must thank you again for keeping me in the loop, Mr. Tajito. Nezu said, smiling for the first time since entering this accursed building. Thank you for allowing me to speak with the Madam President first. I know it took a lot of restraint. Not a problem, sir. The number 2 hero said, his eyes traveling away from the eyes of the frankly justified, scared shitless security force to look into the eyes of the president. It gave me the time I needed to think of what I would say to her. Nezu watched the young man enter the room without another word. The door to the office slammed shut with enough force to shake the room's inhabitants to the floor and knock several paintings off the walls as he did so. Nezu said nothing as he left, stepping over the still frozen bodies of the president's bodyguards as he did so. He would like nothing more than to witness young Mirio tear into the woman, but he knew he did not yet have the time to do it. After all, he had many more calls to make before the day was done. The day had been quite a long one for Izuku Midoriya. To be more accurate though, the past 2 days of the young man's life could only be described as a time management clusterfuck. One where the hours ticked by like minutes and still felt like they would go on forever. Like a bit of a carnival-style roller coaster being operated by someone who was only semi-conscious because of illegal substances. 5 muggings, 2 connivance store stick-ups for carjackings, 12 drunken brawls, a house fire, and an attempted kidnapping, and the human trafficking ring he busted had been the highlights. Still, they were far from the only incidents he got himself involved with. It seemed like Izuku found himself on the opposite side of the city every other hour, breaking criminal jaws or helping a civilian out of a bad situation. In the past 36 hours, Izuku had been up for most of them, only getting a few hours of sleep right before the sun rose on Sunday morning. Frankly, it was one of the busiest times in Izuku's life, and he wouldn't change it for anything. All he needed was a football riot full of hooligans, the most prominent of the United Kingdom organized villain groups, to break up. He would feel like he was back in either the London Underground or the streets of Glasgow. He was a hero, patrolling the streets he had spent his childhood in while defending those who couldn't protect themselves. Izuku could ignore his body's pain and exhaustion and skip yet another meal because he was finally doing what Izuku had wanted to since he was 3. So why did he feel so low? Why are you still here? A voice broke Izuku out of his thoughts, the aggravated voice putting a face to the reason Izuku felt the way that he felt. Don't you know where you're not wanted? Izuku Midoriya ran his hand through his hair, annoyance and aggravation filling his body as he took a deep breath. Half to control himself from doing something stupid and half from stopping himself from saying something he would regret. This was not the first time Izuku had found himself on the receiving end of the anger of a cop, and knowing him, it would not be the last. Don't worry. The young man said, his eyes not leaving the document in his hands as he answered. An action that certainly didn't put him in the good graces of the police officer behind him if the growl that left his lips was anything to go by. I was cleaning up before I left. The man said nothing, only looking at the young hero as he smugly took another puff of his cigarette. He was the detective initially assigned to the cold case investigation, and his years on the police force allowed the man to think he knew what he was doing. But, unfortunately, Izuku knew for a fact that the man was incompetent. Someone who barely kept his job for this long because he knew the right people or more likely, knew who to kiss up to. The type of person who liked to push people around just because they can get away with it. Why don't we stop pretending like we both don't know why you're here? The gruff and older voice said, forcing the light hanging over Izuku's head to shine directly into the young teenager's face. Tell us what we want to know and confess already. Izuku sat silently, straining his eyes to fight back the light shining on his face. If the prison guard wanted him to answer his questions, he was far from knowing what he was doing. Of course, you get more flies from honey than from vinegar, but the days of the Hero Commission promising that he would be released as soon as he told the truth had stopped long ago. Around the same time, Izuku realized they were looking at something other than the truth. He'd been here for about 6 months, or at least he figured it was 6 months. It was hard to tell the measure of time in his windowless cell. Whatever human interaction he could get amounted to, knowing it was a little under a week away from Christmas. He hoped his mother didn't spend it alone. Are you even listening to me? The guard spoke, his face red and eyes popping out of their sockets as he stepped closer to the prisoner. You think this is funny, boy? Izuku's eyes grew hard as he stared at the prison guard, the man's outer shell making him more than twice Izuku's size. Izuku and the Tartarus head guard did not get along. He wants to hurt you, 9. The feeling was mutual. The lobster man had made these few months feel longer than they would typically have. Almost taking pleasure in being an overall annoyance to the teenage inmate, withholding food and other privileges, at the drop of a hat. It almost felt like he was back in middle school all over again. The man swung his giant crab claw down on the table, denting the table slightly right where Izuku's hands were a moment previously. A show of force than anything serious. Just a reminder for Izuku that he could, at any point, decide to get rough with him if Izuku stepped out of line. That was one difference between where he was and his old middle school. Back then, he had to deal with adults who hated him and turned a blind eye to the other children when they bullied him. Now, he was dealing with a grown man who didn't have to hide his dislike of Izuku with a fake smile and could legally assault him if the desire ever crossed his mind. It would be his funeral? You're lucky the Hero Commission doesn't want harm to come to you, boy. The guard said as he leaned down to sneer at the younger boy in his charge. But, of course, the commission was here. The only time he was ever allowed to leave the 10 by 10 foot cell he called home these days was when the commission came around. An action that had seemingly increased in number these past few weeks for whatever reason. The sudden opening of the reinforced door to the interrogation room cut off the tension between the ex-hero student and his current tormentor. The hiss of the vacuum seal of the armored door filled the room as an average-looking man, a prison guard on either side of him, walked into the room without saying a word. He was an average-looking man. Someone with an average height and an average build with black hair slicked back in just the way to hide the fact that he was balding, but not enough to hide the fact that he was slicking his hair back because he was balding. He looked just like the tens of thousands of salary men Izuku had ever seen growing up. But for some reason, Izuku couldn't help but feel like he had seen the man somewhere before. Is the same guy as last time, 9? Was it? It was getting harder and harder for Izuku to recognize the man. The man's quirk did wonders for him and his ability to stay unnoticed. A minor hypnosis that made identifying himself nearly impossible, even with the sophisticated monitoring system keeping an eye on Izuku every hour of every day. The man was a walking, talking sense of déjà vu, one who only ever became noticed when he wanted to. Izuku remembered thinking the man's quirk was interesting before he realized why he was the man the commission sent to deal with him. I'm sorry that we have to be so rough with you, young man, the suited man said with a smile, but not one that filled Izuku with much confidence. But even you must admit you don't need to keep up this act now. Surely you must see that. Izuku said nothing. Didn't even react to the man's words at all. Why would he? It was the same thing every time the man came to talk to Izuku. To plead with Izuku and get him to tell them what he knew about the League of Villains or what All for One was planning. Spill his guts about all the information he had uncovered during his time as a mole. It didn't matter how long they asked. Izuku's answer would be the same thing. Mr. Midoriya, I understand better than most that we must do things we find distasteful to survive. The suited man spoke, removing his thick-rimmed glasses that made Izuku feel that much more familiar with the man than he did a moment ago. I know you wouldn't join the villains unless you had an excellent reason. Izuku still said nothing, but his eyes were no longer focused on the man in front of him. As the commission representative continued to speak, the guard, who had taken a step away from Izuku, had begun to circle around him. The large man slowly began to move. His bulk made it difficult to miss even if Izuku had been paying attention to the commission rep across the desk until he was directly behind Izuku's sitting form. But he still tried to make it stealthy despite everyone in the room knowing full well what he would do. Be careful, 9. Izuku could hear the man's breathing increase. He almost felt the shift in the air as he raised his fist back to strike. It would be a shame if an accident were to befall you before you could confess to your knowledge. Izuku dodged the strike of the crab-claw-armed officer behind him, catching the appendage in his powerful grip, the glow of his quirk almost blinding in the small room. Izuku overextended the pincer, cracking its outer shell as quickly as he would an egg until it was at its breaking point. Izuku ignored the voice in his head to break the man's arm, only staring defiantly at the now concerned-looking man in front of him. If this was some sort of trick, then Izuku was going to find out just what was. "That's enough, Mr. Midoriya." A familiar sound of guns cocking filled Izuku's ears as he watched a slew of armed and armored guards rush into the room, their rifles leveled at Izuku's head. The voice, however, didn't come from any guards but from a woman who followed closely after them. "Let the officer go, Midoriya, or I'm afraid I won't be able to help you." Izuku said nothing, ignoring the guns pointed at his head as he stared the older woman down. Her ash blonde looked different in person than it did in the newspapers. Still, Izuku could recognize the head of the Hero Public Safety Commission a mile away. The thought of fighting his way out of captivity arose within Izuku again. The voices in his head became louder, several distinct voices egging him on. But what then? Be a fugitive? Would that be an admittance of guilt? There's a great way of debuting to the public, becoming a wanted criminal. Besides, what would happen to his mother if he ran away? Would they go after her? Would she be put where he was now? He couldn't risk it. He just had to wait for All Might to come back. Then he'd be able to fix this. Izuku let the crab officer go, ignoring the pain gasps. The man let go as he sat back down in his seat. An action that caused the armed Gaurs to lower their weapons, but not enough to make Izuku feel safe about that many people preparing to kill him if need be. "Thank you for joining us, Madam President," the suited man said as he readjusted his glasses. He tried and failed to make it sound like the head of the Hero Commission visiting was a surprise and not something planned. "I understand you are rather busy, but it would do us well to get this situation situated as quickly as possible." Izuku watched as the woman sat before him without missing a beat. The now two commission workers making Izuku feel more uncomfortable than having a man try to assault him. "Oh, I must concur." The head of the HPSC sat down in front of Izuku, her smile bright and pleasant but fake. "It's so good to meet with you, young man, finally. I've heard a lot about you. From All Might, especially." Izuku shook his head. Internally deciding he had his share of these types of people for an entire lifetime before carefully replacing the evidence and documents into the box he took from when he arrived. In actuality, Izuku should be proud of himself and his accomplishment. It was the first murder investigation he had completed since returning, and solving a cold case an entire department had given up on was quite the feather in his cap. Of course, it would be even better if only the people he was working with weren't complete jerks about the whole ordeal, but Izuku was never one to look a gift horse in the mouth. While most heroes made their money arresting criminals who were caught in the act of a crime or saving and protecting civilians during accidents and natural disasters, a lot of them even made revenue on merchandise. Still, Izuku had learned from experience that investigating cold cases was a usually untapped source of income for any young hero. Especially one like Izuku, who needed solid ties within the hero community after arriving back in his hometown just under a week ago and formally starting his professional hero career less than 48 hours ago. While it wasn't much, it did allow Izuku to stretch his investigative skills far more than just breaking bones and smashing faces permitted him. In retrospect, Izuku shouldn't have been so blunt regarding how simple it had been. After all, he doubted many cops took to being shown up by some 20-something-year-old who had only been on the job for less than 2 days. But honestly, fuck them. It wasn't Izuku's fault they were incompetent, and it certainly wasn't Izuku's fault that he knew what he was doing. It was his job after all. The victim, a man whose face had been wrapped with bloodied bandages, was found in a long-since abandoned warehouse and had not been identified for almost 2 months. The sad fact was hundreds of murders went unsolved yearly, with thousands more just disappearing and never being seen again. If Izuku was honest with himself, he could see why. The victim's fingertips had been burned off, not by fire but by a particular acid that just about anyone could buy over the counter at most hardware stores. The victim had nothing in his pockets when he was found, no phone, wallet, or even anything to indicate who he was. But it was once the bandages had been cut off the victim's face that the investigation, for lack of a better term, hit a wall. The man's face, or what had been left of the man's face, showed little in the amount of identifying marks. To the point that even the specialist whose quirk allowed him to be momentarily revitalized destroyed organic material couldn't heal enough damage to make identification possible. It was less the work of a surgeon with a scalpel and more like a butcher with a cleaver. But whether the damage was done to the man's body before, during, or even after the murder was anyone's guess. Most of the department checked any and all evidence regarding the case in a box marked as under investigation, and spent the past few weeks passing it off to different investigators. Before each one inevitably hit a wall and then gave up. The case had gone cold, and no one held much hope that they would ever be able to solve it. So the box containing the evidence was left forgotten in a broom closet to collect dust, the victim not even having a name. So, when Izuku arrived an hour ago, it came to the shock and even annoyance of many of those same officers when Izuku discovered the man's identity. Kenji Furuta, Izuku said confidently as he stared down the station chief, the small man's eyes going wide as the professional hero towered over him. He was reported missing out of Osaka around the time the body had been found. Height and weight match, so does the blood type. Izuku stood motionless in the center of the room, taking the attention of the detectives and senior officers as if he was a freak show up on display. He could sense thing was off the moment he walked into the station but couldn't understand the difference between how the station chief looked at him the night before and how the old man looked at him now. That could be anyone, someone had said, sounding almost offended at Izuku's theory. Izuku had seen this type of thing before, usually in smaller police precincts where many junior officers looked down on outsider help when solving a crime. He remembered a double homicide assailant almost getting away with in Budapest, all because his commanding officer was dragging his feet regarding listening to Izuku's evidence. Hundreds of thousands of men in Japan fit that description. It was true. A man with an average height, average weight, and the most common blood type were, by definition, common. But for Izuku, it had been the first step in identifying the victim. The missing person reports say that Kenji had a birthmark on the back of his neck, a distinct spiral-looking mark that fits your victim. The victim also shows scarring on his left leg, which indicates a recently healed femur. Kenji Furuta's medical records indicate he suffered an injury mountain biking last year. A broken left leg in the exact same place as your victim. The assembled group of senior detectives still needed to be convinced. Still, they kept quiet out of fear of being corrected in front of their superiors. Kenji Furuta also has a quirk that allows him to secrete acid, specifically acetone, from parts of his body. Impossible, the captain corrected. The way he spoke made Izuku feel they weren't on the same side as one another. The killer used the acid to destroy his fingerprints, making it harder to identify the body. Then why were there traces of acetone in the victim's shoes? And in his hair and in his nose? All places where Kenji's quirk allowed him to secrete acid. Izuku said with a shrug. Looking back on it all made Izuku realize that, for whatever reason, they had been trying and failing to poke holes in Izuku's theory. I checked with the coroner's report, and your victim's sweet glands are swimming with trace amounts of acetone. Like mine used to say, acid gets everywhere if you aren't careful. I looked into it further and found out that Kenji had a falling out with a business partner with a history of violent assaults that he managed to sweep under the rug. Izuku finished, ignoring the now dumbfounded looks from the detectives and officers as he held up another picture, a mugshot of a well-put-together man in a business suit. He was arrested 6 months ago after threatening to murder Kenji's fiancée with a butcher knife. He was caught on security footage in a convenience store less than a kilometer from where the body was found, less than an hour before it was found. Oh, that should have been it. The cold case was cracked, with the victim identified and a murder suspect named. Izuku was sure he could get the suspect to confess to his actions if he was allowed into the interview. But of course not everyone wanted to have some rookie walk through the door and show them up at their own job. So, when the station chief denied Izuku's request to assist them in the arrest, Izuku wasn't surprised. He didn't get a handshake or a pat on the back. He didn't even get a thank you for his work. Instead, Izuku received glares and cold shoulders from those he walked past. Whatever dislike of him they had kept hidden was now being shown to the whole world. Before Izuku landed in Japan, he asked himself how long it would last. How long could he stay home before the glares and the whispers came back? Well, he got his answer. 2 days. You got lucky, the older man said, the disdain in his voice already getting on Izuku's nerves more than he would admit. The shtick of having a veteran cop giving the new hero on the scene a hard time had already gotten old for the young man. Just watch it or you'll find yourself out the door with a boot up your ass. So that's how this was going to be. Izuku stood up from his seat, pushing back the chair without force to make the disgruntled police officer jump up. Instead, he sauntered to the older man, emphasizing every inch of Izuku's 6 feet 6 inches frame and every ounce of his 235 pounds. Izuku had long since stopped caring about being nice to people who disliked him. He promised himself long ago that he would not turn the other cheek when someone threatened him, especially when he did nothing wrong. The police officer, who but a moment ago sneered and belittled Izuku as if he was nothing more than a criminal, took a step back. Then he took another and then another until his back leaned against the wall of the interrogation room, near the sole door to the room. Whatever confidence and attitude he once held were gone. As if the knowledge that a man nearly a foot taller than him and outweighed him by almost 100 pounds was coming towards him had short-circuited the police officer's mind. Maybe he was thinking of the Yakuza enforcer Izuku had knocked out with a single punch, still sitting in a holding cell after Izuku had dropped him off the night before. Maybe he was thinking about the car door Izuku had ripped off to shield himself from a villain's fire breath. Or maybe the cop was thinking about Izuku's gnarled and knotted knuckles smashing into his eye socket and nose repeatedly until the older man's face looked like it was made out of ground pork. It was almost like insulting a professional hero wasn't a bright idea, especially when the hero was already not in the best of moods. But instead of a punch to his jaw or a huge gloved hand around his neck, the officer watched silently as Izuku reached down to the door handle. It swung open with enough force to almost take it off its hinges as Izuku stared down at the older man with a smile on his face and a threat hanging in the air. "Would you do me a favor and get me a cup of coffee?" the younger man said, his smile shining brightly as he stared down at the face of his accompanying officer. "I've been up for hours already and if I don't get some caffeine, I don't know what I'll do." Despite the friendly tone and smile, the veteran officer knew a threat when he heard one. He knew when push came to shove, the only reason he was able to walk out the door was that the hero in front of him allowed it to happen. He backed away through the now open door, his wide eyes making him look like a scared rabbit being allowed to leave the presence of a dire wolf. Izuku wouldn't hit first, but he would undoubtedly hit last. If the police officer in front of him wanted to play games with him and thought Izuku wouldn't retaliate, then Izuku would correct him and anyone dumb enough to try the same thing. He refused to be pushed around anymore. Izuku moved back to the desk, stuffing the rest of the evidence into the box with more force than before. At this point he just wanted to leave and go home before he ended up putting someone through a table. He sighed as he reflexively rubbed the corner of his eyes, already somewhat regretting the decision to come back home. When he returned to Japan he knew it wouldn't be easy. Sure, his name had been cleared of wrongdoing and he was in the clear legally, but that didn't change matters when it came to everyday people. Especially when they lacked trust in the institutions that cleared his name. "Fucking," Izuku muttered to himself as he exited the room. Whatever patience he had left after this weekend seemingly evaporated as all the young man wanted to do now was to return to his office and end the night with cheap takeout. But like so many things in Izuku's life, he found himself face first with something he didn't want to deal with. Or someone. He must have been more tired than he thought if it took this long to notice the familiar figures in front of him, which should have been more of a reason for him to leave. But the old hero nerd instincts had yet to die entirely in Izuku. As the young man froze where he stood the second, he realized he was no longer the only man in the room with a hero costume. "I was told Mr. Midoriya was here." The huge man spoke. His deep baritone voice was enough to gain the attention of every man and woman in the building, even if the large man wasn't completely covered in flames. "Where is he?" Izuku sighed, his shoulders slumping as he watched the mortified-looking station chief. The same man he had reported to earlier stuttered and flailed as he stared into the somewhat intimidating sight. The number 1 hero, Endeavor, and his son, the number 11 hero, Shoto, made an intimidating sight for those not expecting it. "I'm sorry, Izuku," Shoto said, his voice never leaving its normal ice-like tone but somehow feeling colder to Izuku's ears than it did at the beginning of the school year. "There were only 2 spots open regarding internships. And my father was insistent on Bakugo? There's nothing to apologue for," Izuku said with a smile. Sure, it stung that he wouldn't be in a work-study program with his friends, but it certainly wasn't something Shoto needed to be sorry about. "I'll just be stuck at school for a couple of weeks. So it's no big deal." In actuality, Izuku felt somewhat relieved by the fact. After the death of Sir Night-Eye just a few months ago, Izuku had found himself hitting a bit of a rough patch. Despite what Mirio said, the Greenite still blamed himself for not being quick enough to save the veteran hero. Maybe he still needed to be ready to throw himself into another hero's tutelage so soon. But with the man's death, All Might and Gran Torino leaving the country for an untold amount of time, Izuku found himself without any intern offer in what had become a very competitive market. "So you'll be under Aizawa-sensei's supervision," Shoto said, relief filling his eyes as he nodded to himself. "So you won't be alone." "Pretty much," the Greenite said with a smile, the buzzing of a headache returning full force as he turned away from his friend. He had been getting a lot of those these past few weeks. He should see Recovery Girl's temporary replacement for a checkup when he has the chance. Aizawa said Shinso and I are going to be working together a lot. So, it shouldn't be too bad. His former friend looked good. He was taller and broader than he was the last time Izuku saw him, going through the same growth spurt Izuku himself had these past few years. But he was lean, at least compared to the heavyweight his father was, looking far more built for speed than pure power. His hair was cropped short, and the bangs he used to hide his scar from the world were gone. But overall he looked just what Izuku expected his former classmate to look like. He had even kept the design of his hero uniform consistent from their days in school. That flaming goatee was a nice touch though. Despite everything that happened, he still followed the carriers of his old classmates. Call it a bad habit, one he hadn't fully kicked yet. Call it a sad cry for help or the same stalkerish behavior that turned so many against Izuku when he was younger. Whatever it was, Izuku knew it wasn't healthy and had long since decided to stop in order for him to move on from the mess his teenage years had been. But life, as they say, always finds a way. Neither of them noticed him, and for a moment, Izuku was thankful for his growth spurt. The fact that he ditched the emerald green of his UA hero suit for the darker shade he wore now probably helped too, but not as much as being a foot taller than he was in school. Whatever the reason was, they didn't recognize him, which was a bit of a godsend for Izuku. Izuku contemplated leaving before the police captain could answer the hero's question. Izuku didn't doubt he could lose them in a crowd. He had slipped away from worse odds when he worked undercover in Hong Kong and the Seoul Underground. It wouldn't even be the first time he escaped the notice of one of his former classmates. Besides, he was far too tired and annoyed to deal with whatever Endeavor wanted to say to him. So the least said about Shoto the better. But before Izuku could move, he saw Shoto's eyes meet his own, the blue and red iris widening in shock and fear as recognition slowly filled them. Despite himself, Izuku found himself back 6 years in the past. Staring down the son of the then number 2 hero and in front of a sold-out crowd and millions of televised onlookers at the UA Sports Festival. Back before everything went to shit. Well? Izuku said, steeling his features as he watched his former classmate take a tentative step toward him. Shoto looked to be battling himself on what to do and what to say, but Izuku couldn't even imagine what those words could be for his life. Here I am. Seeing how he now had no chance to leave unnoticed, Izuku took a step forward. He hoped to get whatever the 2 top heroes wanted over and done with so Izuku could grab a bite to eat and go home, but he didn't like his chances. He didn't expect to see Shoto flinch from Izuku's lackluster response, like Izuku's words were like a slap to his face. Izuku, Shoto said, his voice almost as brassy and deep as his father now. It's you? The 2 former classmates stared awkwardly at one another, different emotions mixing and twisting within each of their minds. Yep, Izuku said, his lips popping the P in yep as he did, already too uncomfortable with how the situation was playing out. It's me. Shoto sat silently at his desk, surveying the rest of his class with a quiet intensity few could hope to match. While some tried to ignore the growing pits in their stomach, all Shoto could see was the ever-increasing level of discontent in the eyes of most of his classmates. Ida had not spoken all weekend, locking himself in his room as he tried to make sense of the situation. Unfortunately, this action proved fruitless if the look of confusion and furrowed brow on his face was anything to go by. Chako was distant. Almost like how she was when the traitor business had first started, shutting herself off from the world as she came to terms with the betrayal of her best friend. Shoto could still feel the sting of it himself. Not a day went by when the thought of the green-haired boy who had dragged Shoto out of the pit of delusion and self-hatred kicking and screaming on live TV didn't cross his mind. Izuku had been one of the most precious people in Shoto's life, the catalyst for Shoto to get out of his shell and be a better hero in person. But now, all those good memories and precious moments felt tainted, as if they were calculated and done for Shoto to lower his guard around the boy who was planning their downfall. It made him sick to think about it. But like so many times before, Shoto now didn't know what to think or how to feel. He was surrounded by people he called friends, feeling almost as alone as the first day of his first year of school, the same scared little kid who clutched his all-might action figure to his chest whenever he heard his mom and dad argue about Shoto and his training. Ochako was much the same way as he was. For a while they took comfort in their mutual loneliness. But while the rest of the class moved on with their lives, Shoto felt himself step backward. He didn't blame Ochako for getting together with Bakugo. She needed to get over Izuku the same way they all needed to. But then Dabi, the pyromaniac of the League of Villains, tried to burn Izuku's childhood home to the ground, with the boy's mother locked inside. It didn't make sense. None of it did, and despite the best efforts of everyone in the class, Shoto could begin to see the same thoughts he had in his head drift into the faces of all those around him, student and teacher alike. Why would the League attack a family member of one of their own? Especially when said family member had been vocal in supporting her imprisoned son. None of it made sense. It also had the unfortunate consequence of several members of his class re-evaluating what they knew and what they didn't know about the situation they had been so sure about just a few weeks prior. "You guys are crazy," he remembered Jiro say, her eyes not meeting any of their own for more than a second as she spoke. "So why bring this up now? Haven't we been through enough because of what he did? It's just, why would they attack Izuku's mom?" Momo said one day. Still, Shoto knew enough of the class vice president to know that while she tried to keep a calm front for her friends internally, she was in a storm of paranoia as Momo went through every piece of information she could gather about the case against Izuku with a renewed vigor. "I know he's a villain. But his own mother? Villains do fucked up shit." Bakugo shouted, mentioning the boy who had sold him out to villains enough to transform the bombastic blonde into the same antagonistic asshole he had been when Shoto first met him. "That's what makes them villains." Ochako, however, had been silent. She had been for a long time and not just to Shoto. He tried not to pry regarding his friends' interpersonal relationships. God knew he wasn't an expert in romantic relationships. That ship had sailed long ago. But even so, even with his limited understanding, he could tell that the class couple, Ochako and Bakugo, were on the outs, despite the explosion user's refusal to see what was in front of his own eyes. They had been fighting a lot more these past few days, the difference in their personalities splitting the once happy relationship from its seams. The stress of these new questions and the League's actions only accelerated that fact. Bakugo was even more upset than usual, a distinction he would seemingly make everyone else's problem today. After all, he had known Izuku's mom his entire life. Despite his opinions on the son, his views on the Midoriya matriarch hadn't changed since he was 4, or so he said. But even he didn't know what to think about the idea that Izuku played a part in the attempted murder of his mother, right? Shoto watched as the last members of his class filtered into the classroom, an annoyed and angry-looking Bakugo, a concerned and regretful-looking Mina, a defensive and protective-looking Tsu, and Ochako, who looked as if she was only holding in her tears out of spite. Another fight. Shoto thought to himself somewhat bitterly. The telltale signs of a fractured relationship are as straightforward for anyone, let alone Shoto, to read as a printed piece of paper. "Now class, I know we are all concerned with the news over the weekend," the HPSC representative said with a dull and monotone voice. The same voice the man seemed to use whenever one of them asked for information regarding the investigation into Izuku's criminal activities. There was little he could discuss with them, he always said. Only those who were in the know needed to know after all. But lately Shoto had seen the same look of frustration etched on the faces of the administration, none more annoyed by the HPSC's lack of transparency than their former home teacher turned temporary headmaster, Eraserhead. But even after so many months since the traitor investigation was put to rest with Izuku behind bars, the man that acted as the HPSC liaison and representative in UA never really left. He stayed in the tiny office he had been given when gathering information about Midoriya's guilt, his presence doing little to improve the school's morale. On the contrary, too many associated him with the worst times of their life. They avoided his presence whenever he spoke to them regarding their future employment when they left UA. Most wanted to forget about Izuku and continue their schooling. It was difficult with the HPSC lingering so close to home. "I assure you that the Hero Commission is investigating this crime, and the villains involved will be brought to justice and... But Miss Midoriya is okay, right?" Ochako said, not even bothering to raise her hand to ask. For once, Aizawa-sensei didn't move to reprimand his student for speaking out of turn, turning to look into the eyes of the committee representative for the answer. Their teacher still needed to give them the details of the crime when he announced it to them Saturday evening, something he may not have been supposed to do if the look on the HPSC rep-turned-temp principal was anything to go by. "Inko Midoriya is fine. As many of you know, a similar incident occurred some weeks ago. We at the commission had decided it would be in the best interests of everyone involved to move to a safe house until things cooled down," the man said, his tone of voice not changing despite the horror etched onto the faces of the students in front of him. "I assure you we have things under control." Shoto noticed something off at that moment, a shift in how their homeroom teacher stood and a look of panic and confusion crossing the stoic man's face. It made Shoto feel uneasy as the HPSC officer continued speaking. Did their teacher know something they didn't? Was it something they couldn't say? Or was it something they knew they shouldn't say? Whatever the reason was, it fueled the questions that commanded Shoto's mind for the rest of that day and into the long sleepless night ahead of him. No one in his class was vocal about it, but Shoto could tell they were all thinking about it. What else was the HPSC not telling them? Shoto felt his throat go dry as he stared at the glass of amber liquid before him. He wasn't a drinker, only occasionally when in the company of others and no more than he had to. Nevertheless, despite the social drinking he had done in the past, he could count the times he had bypassed his sobriety and the rare times he drank and still had fingers left over. He mulled over his thoughts as he waited for the bartender to set the drinks of his companions down, a warm bottle of his father's favorite sake and lone cup acting as a familiar and firmly needed port in the storm of emotions that Shoto felt he was going through at the moment. His father had taken him to this bar, a small establishment in the middle of Tenkaichi Street called Serena, when Shoto had graduated from UA to share his first drink. The fact that Shoto had been the first son who had done this despite being his youngest son was not lost on Shoto. But despite everything his father had done in Shoto's life, the number 11 hero could tell that his father had changed since Shoto's first year as a hero student. He was trying to improve, and while it may not be enough for others, it was enough for Shoto to give him a chance to improve. But every ounce of pettiness and annoyance, the hatred and bitterness he once held for the man, the ones he had tried so hard to squash and move on from, seemed to rise back to the surface. Like some greedy shark just trying to take one more bite out of a surfer who had started to bleed to death long ago. Because his father had decided, without bothering to ask Shoto for his opinion or his blessing, he took it upon himself to try and mediate Shoto's fractured relationship with the third member of this sad little drinking party. It's custom never to pour your own sake when drinking with someone, his father said, pouring the warm sake into one of the 3 small cups placed in front of him before placing it in front of the impassive face that had haunted Shoto for the past 6 years. Izuku Midoriya, the friend and brother he had thrown off to the side like he had been a piece of trash, hadn't said a word since the 3 men had entered the establishment. The man silently sat down, not even looking in Shoto's general direction. The half-and-half quirk wielder froze up, numbly following his father's motion. The green-haired man said nothing, his eyes never wavering even momentarily as he held Shoto's gaze. The number 11 hero's eyes faltered and drifted downward slightly to avoid the dark thoughts that Izuku's eyes reminded him of. Before he, too, filled the empty cup in front of him with alcohol, pushing the cup and warm sake bottle towards Shoto. Shoto said nothing as he filled his father's cup, half expecting 6 years of anger and resentment to pour from Izuku at any moment, tensing up with a twitch of movement that passed through his features. He hadn't seemed angry, but Shoto knew from experience what that kind of anger does to a person. Like a house fire burning everything, it touched into blackened cinders. "Allow us to drink to a promising partnership," his father spoke, his deep baritone filling the room even more so than the flames had. He raised his sake cup to his lips and sipped the liquid. Izuku followed soon after, raising his cup in a token action of a toast before downing the alcohol in a single practiced gulp. He drank like someone used to the feeling of alcohol burning down his throat, but someone who took no enjoyment from it. Shoto didn't know how to feel about that. Shoto raised his glass to his father's words but did not drink. The fear that he wouldn't be able to stop if he started was far too precarious for him to risk. "While I have to say I'm a bit surprised to be invited out for a drink by 2 top heroes," Midoriya said, his tone even as he stared at the 2 generations of Todoroki before him. "Honored but still surprised. I feel this isn't about getting to know the newest hero around the corner, huh? Very perceptive of you." The flaming hero Endeavor said. The flaming facial hair dispelled the moment they entered the establishment, allowing his faint facial scars to shine like a billboard in the midday sun. "As much as I would like it to be." Shoto watched as his father took out his phone, opened the latest email from the president of the HPSC, and placed it directly in front of Izuku without even uttering a word. Shoto bit his lip, silently cursing his father's bluntness regarding their delicate situation. Shoto wanted to say something but found the case far too precarious to attempt. His father was never the best with words, but at least he was putting some effort in. Far more so than Shoto had, anyway. "So the boy already has made arrangements for his work study," the number 2 hero said from his desk, the flames of his hellfire quirk looking somewhat subdued as he spoke to his son. "That's rather disappointing." "Yes." Shoto lied, silently thankful for his normal emotionless tone of voice to control the tremor he felt rush through his body when he spoke the single-word response. "He told me several days ago that he had already chosen where to spend his work study, though he was somewhat hesitant to tell me who." "Seems odd." His father responded, his disappointment at not having Izuku under his wing alongside Shoto visible on his face as he returned to the paperwork that resulted from running one of the largest hero agencies in the world. He seemed like the type not to be able to keep a secret to save his life, far too honest for his own good. "If only you knew," Shoto thought, biting his tongue to keep himself from responding to his father's words. Whatever hesitation and misgivings Shoto might have had regarding his former friend's guilt had long since been eroded as fact after the fact had been thrown in his face. He felt sick to think that Shoto had almost become an unwilling pawn for Izuku's machinations and schemes. To think that the boy who broke Shoto out of his shell and had reinvigorated his desire to be a hero had been a double agent this whole time. It didn't make any sense, but there it was, staring him in the face, mocking him with fake smiles and spiteful laughter. "I'm sure he has his reasons," Shoto said, looking away from his father out of fear that the passive mask he wore to hide his contempt would be found out. However, the HPSC had a plan for Izuku, which would be jeopardized if anyone like his father learned about it. "He has a lot on his plate after all." "Yes," Endeavor said, stopping the constant writing as he turned to look directly at his son, the young hero student shifting and shuffling in his seat as his father stared heavily at him. "He's been through a lot these past few months." Shoto knew in the back of his head that his father didn't mean for his words to sound like an accusation, but Shoto couldn't help but feel that his father was implying something. It was almost typical for the Hellfire hero to look at a delicate situation Shoto had found himself in and choose to stand up for someone who didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt to be given to him. Shoto balled his fists at the thought of it but controlled himself. He needed to keep his father in the dark regarding the HPSC plans. Midoriya had already fooled their entire school for this long before their eyes opened. He could only imagine what kind of chaos the outside world would fall into if the team managed to get professional heroes on his twisted side. Some would call them cruel, and in some ways they indeed were, but they needed to do what needed to be done. But they knew the truth. Despite how many sleepless nights Shoto had had since this all started, despite how many times he had almost broken down in tears about what he needed to do. He needed to do this to be the hero he promised his mother he would be. "Shoto," his father started. His grizzled voice was never something Shoto could describe as soft, but it was undoubtedly quieter now than it had been in years. "Is there something you want to?" The pro-hero paused as if the weight of the words were too much for him to ask, to the point where Shoto felt his heart race at the implication. If his father knew. "Son." Endeavor spade out like the words he was speaking were physically painful for him to say. "If there is something you want to talk about, I want you to know. I have to go." Shoto finished, cutting his father off as he went to the large ornate doors leading out of his father's spacious office. "I'm due for a patrol in 5 minutes. Shoto paused the moment he touched the door handle. The weight of his father's words and their implications and what he needed to do regarding Midoriya made his knees buckle and strain. He closed his eyes tight as he willed the feelings to stop, feeling a numbness overcome him that seemingly froze his unshed tears before they could fall from his eyes. "We can talk about this," he said, his even tone breaking slightly as he left the room. "Soon." "Well, that certainly explains a lot," Izuku said, his voice tired as he slid the phone back towards the oldest man at the table. "My first weekend on the job isn't even over, and they're already putting me on blast. It is rather distasteful." Endeavor spoke, pausing to find the right word to describe the situation that wasn't a string of curse words. "Especially after everything that has happened to you regarding my son." Shoto stilled, his father's words almost making Shoto feel like he was about to break into a million pieces. He had spent these 5 years wrestling with his actions, replaying questions of what ifs and what should have been on repeat until those words stopped having any meaning. Thoughts and daydreams of him not falling for the lies and falsehoods he had been given used to be the only thing he could think about. But you can't change the past, and learning to live with your actions was far more difficult than living in a fantasy where nothing bad ever happened. "I don't blame you for what your son did," Izuku said as he drank the cup of sake Endeavor had refilled. "Dabi was a villain. It's not your fault." Shoto stilled. "Were they not talking about? My son firebombed your home." Endeavor growled, his voice returning to life momentarily before it died back down. "It almost killed your mother. Whatever your son did has nothing to do with you. My son's road to villainy was paved with my mistakes and failings as a hero and a father," Endeavor said as he downed another cup of sake, looking far more pensive than he did a moment ago. His eyes grew solemn and sad, and his entire body seemed to deflate the more he spoke. The ghost of Toya stretched long and deep into the wounds of the Todoroki family, his memory and deeds doing little to bring the famous family peace. "I hold myself responsible for my children's actions, especially after I failed them." Shoto felt a tremor travel up his spine at his father's words, his jaw clenching to stop the words from escaping at every reminder of Shoto's own failings. Dabi. Toya's attack against Midoriya's home had not been the first time he regretted what he played a part in. It wasn't the first time he thought that the whole thing didn't make any sense. But it was the first time he noticed that everyone he knew started questioning what was happening behind the scenes. The HSPC chalked it up to internal fighting between the League. A power struggle after Shigaraki had been placed in Tartarus all those months ago after Kamino. Dabi is a sociopath. Shoto remembered someone saying that a man like Dabi didn't need a reason to do what he did. So, like a rabid dog chasing a car and not knowing what he would do if he caught it, Dabi just did things. But Shoto knew better than most about the why behind his brother's decision. Even before the truth had been revealed, Shoto felt off whenever he was around the blue flames or its wielder. A sinking suspicion that he could remember the sound of that voice or the look in his eyes. Eyes that were full of hate but not irrational. "Is that why you invited me here?" Izuku questioned, looking far and away the most aggravated he had looked since Shoto had seen him last. "Invite me over for a couple of drinks and say you're sorry for the fucked up shit your son did to me." Midoriya wasn't looking at Shoto when he spoke, but his words felt like daggers to his heart. How could Shoto judge his brother for what he did after everything Shoto himself had done? Shoto hid his eyes low, the fear of Izuku's eyes looking at him with that same level of vitriol and disgust too much for the young man to handle. Shoto reached out to his still full cup of sake and took a swig, downing the warm beverage in a single gulp before he moved to pour himself another drink. He noticed his father look at him from the corner of his eye but said nothing about it. Only when Shoto's second drink was poured and drank did his father respond to Midoriya's question. "No, I am here to offer you protection from what the Hero Commission is getting ready to throw at you," Endeavor spoke. Whatever moroseness and melancholy tinged his voice before was gone, replaced with the unyielding fire that had made his father a legend within the hero community. "I'm offering to buy your agency from you and offer you a position working directly under me." Despite himself, Shoto looked up to see Midoriya's reaction. It was his idea originally for his father to make this offer to Izuku, to have the #1 hero in the country throw all of his weight and influence behind the freshman hero and dare the commission to even try to throw Izuku under the metaphorical bus. His father didn't need much convincing, his rage at the accusations and implications the commission had thrown around regarding what would happen to anyone in the top 10 offering the newly minted hero barely subsiding before they had managed to find Izuku at that police station less than an hour ago. Shoto didn't like to think this was redemption for his past actions, nor did he think this would make them even. Of course, nothing Shoto could do would compensate for what he did, but this was a good start. Maybe it could even be the first step to returning to the good graces of the man he had betrayed. Midoriya said nothing, looking less angry than he did a moment ago, almost like he used to when inspiration struck. Midoriya was either about to do something inspiring, completely dangerous, or likely both. Shoto felt a pain in his chest when he saw it. He had forgotten how much he missed seeing that look cross Midoriya's face. Like a memory from some long-lost moment suddenly brought back to the forefront of his mind by the smell of a newly opened notebook or the specific sound of a pen on a piece of paper. He forgot how much he missed his friend. "I'm flattered." "Really I am," Izuku started, his voice even and friendly but his expression never changing from the sad smile he wore nearly exclusively since they had met back up together. "But I can't accept your offer." Shoto sat stunned, unable to speak or formulate a thought to illustrate his feelings as Izuku politely but firmly rejected the offer. No one could have likely taken the proposal from his father, a personal invitation by the #1 hero to work with him and as added protection against being railroaded and blacklisted by the entire hero industry by the Japanese governing body. The world would be against Izuku and still he refused to look to Shoto for help. "Why not?" Shoto said, almost shouting as he stood up from his seat, his harsh words enough to shock not only his father but the rest of the guests in the bar, every eye in the room staring at the wide eyes of one of the most recognizable faces in the country. "Why won't you let us help you?" As Midoriya stared into Shoto's eyes, the half-and-half hero felt the enormous weight of his past seemingly crash into him for the first time in a long time. A massive tidal wave was beating down on him as Shoto relived every bad decision and every wrong turn that brought him to where he stood, like some fucked-up slideshow showing his most significant failings. But at that moment he realized there wasn't any hatred or disgust in the eyes of the man staring at him. No resentment, hatred, or even a hint of annoyance seemed to register on the man's features. It was the least Shoto deserved for the part he played, the bad guy that betrayed the hero's trust and turned his back on him. The idea kept him up at night sometimes that no matter what he said or accomplished, he would always be the type of man who would sell out his friends and throw his loved ones under the bus if things got too onerous or complicated. And no matter how many people he saved, he'd still be the same weak little coward that didn't help his friend when he needed it most deep down inside. He had gotten used to the idea that Midoriya, his first friend and the first person who believed in his dream, hated him, but the truth was far more painful to realize. All Shoto could see was the impassive stare of neutrality staring back at him, like he was nothing more than a stranger on the street. He didn't know what he was preparing for, but Shoto knew this was far worse than anything he could have imagined. You may not understand. I don't blame you for not understanding. Izuku started, his voice controlled and even a little kind as he spoke. But my agency is everything I built with my own 2 hands. It's not much, but it's mine. Shoto sat down silently, his eyes drifting low as shame overwhelmed his senses. He deserved this. He knew that, but it still hurt to realize it. I know I'm gonna have to fight. I've been fighting my whole life to get to where I am now, and if that means I have to fight the Hero Commission, then I'm going to fight the Hero Commission. The young man said as he stood up from his chair, leaving a handful of clean and crisp bills to cover his third of the sake bottle. I won't have someone else fight my battles for me. Shoto said nothing as Midoriya walked away. What could he say that could have made this event better? I'm Sora. Sorry wouldn't fix this. It couldn't. Words meant nothing if you weren't able to show your actions. Nothing could make it go back to how things were, but as Shoto stared at the money on the table, only one thing seemed to drift into his head. I can't believe you're flunking English, Izuku said at the lunch table, his food momentarily forgotten as he went through Shoto's pile of failed writing assignments. Present Mike doesn't even score Mina or Kirishima that bad. Lunch was usually the time of the day when Todoroki could relax from the stress of the average school day. A time when he could just shut his brain off for a little bit and not have to worry about grades or training. But this particular lunch period had been particularly grating for the youngest child of Endeavor, especially when it came to a particular subject. He didn't like my creative writing. The two-toned hero in training said, more than a little miffed at his failure at writing a compelling narrative. He says I need to add more detail to my words. Whatever that means. It was the one class he always struggled in. No matter how hard he tried, Shoto couldn't rise up to the standards he set for himself in his other classes. Testing was easy and his technical skill in the language was above average to say the least, but putting his knowledge into practice was always like trying to get blood from a stone. You are pretty bare bones. Not like that's a bad thing or anything. Izuku said, putting the papers down on the cafeteria table as he gave Shoto a concerned smile. But I can see where Mike-sensei is coming from. Shoto watched silently as Izuku neatly put all of Shoto's failed attempts at creative writing off to the side as he began to pull out one of the many notebooks he had seen on the boy's person. He always wondered why Izuku carried those things everywhere he went. Still, Shoto figured that was why he had the top marks in their English course. You know you don't have to help me, right? Shoto said, somewhat embarrassed at needing help from his friend after everything the boy had already done for him. I can figure this out myself. Which means you'll figure it out faster if you had some help. The boy said with a smile as he pulled a fresh piece of paper and a newly sharpened pencil from his book bag. After all, sticking your nose in other people's business, it's what makes a real hero. Shoto felt a tear roll down his cheek as he watched the young man leave, the hole in his stomach growing and growing until he thought he was going to fall into himself. His former friend had given Shoto the world and in return he had thrown him into hell. He'll never be forgiven for what he did, but if he didn't do anything to help, then the voice in his head he heard during his darkest nights was right, and he didn't deserve to be a hero. That boy is going to need help. His father said, displeasure at being rebuked evident in his voice, but his respect for the man who did it was as clear as glass. Whether he likes it or not. Shoto refilled his glass with the warm sake, passing it to his father as the two members of the Todoroki clan silently gulped down their drinks. A silent agreement formed between the two as they watched the young man leave the bar. Even if it took the rest of his life, Shoto would prove, if not to Izuku, then to himself, that he had changed. A hero helps those who need help even if they don't want it. This was a terrible idea. That was the prevailing thought bouncing around the mind of Ochako Uraraka the moment her vision returned to her. The cloud of pure white flour that filled the air around her marred and distorted the image of the once pristine-looking kitchen. A pool of white spread across the floor where she dropped one of the gallons of milk the class kept stocked in the communal kitchen after she ran into the open door of the fridge. Ochako had forgotten to close it. Her face left red from both the impact and embarrassment as she moved to grab an entire roll of paper towels to clean up the mess before it got anywhere else. So this is what she gets for trying and failing to clean up the splattered eggs and melted butter off the ceiling after she turned the mixer on because Bakugo and those stupid protein shake he has to make every morning on the machine's highest settings. He forgot to change the settings back to normal when he was done using the blender this morning and had to make it someone else's problem instead of, she didn't know, putting the appliance back how he found it. Was asking the jerk to be cordialite to the rest of the class so much? Or at least pretend that he did. Sorry, Ochako was having quite the day. The less said about the pot of melted chocolate chips currently floating in midair, drizzling all over the top of Ochako's head, the better. Sato had just cleaned the whole kitchen 3 days ago, and she had managed to ruin all his hard work in less time than it takes to watch an episode of one of the animes. Kirishima was dying to get them all to watch with him. She just wanted to bake a stupid cake. Was that so much to ask? She put her fingertips together with a sigh, the now empty pot clanging to the tile floor, making Ochako almost cringe as she looked upon the aftermath of her attempt at baking. Sue was right. Going to the store and buying a cake would have been easier than dealing with the mess in front of her, but of course, Ochako couldn't be talked out of something when she put her mind to doing it. She'd be done by now if she had listened to her friend, and with Momo ready, willing, and more than able to pay for it herself, it should have been a no-brainer. Why did she tell Sato she didn't need his help? That guy knew the kitchen like the back of his hand and had been more than willing to let her take all the credit for making the birthday cake. But knew she just had to make it herself. It wouldn't be special if she didn't make the birthday cake herself, and what was the point if Izuku's birthday cake wasn't special? When Ochako first heard that Deku's birthday was just a few days away, she had a rather unfortunate response. It wasn't every day that one of Ochako's best friends made her feel frustrated. The boy was notorious for being the type of guy no one could dislike after all. But God is Ochako's witness, Izuku not telling their class when his birthday was and acting like it wasn't a big deal was just. It made her want to squeeze his freckled cheeks until he promised never to hide anything from her again. The green-haired boy himself had almost fallen over out of shock at the image of the Mie Prefecture native, aggressively questioning why he had never told anyone about his birthday plans. Ochako was the first to admit that their class was immensely frustrating. Of course, the less said about Bakugo's nonsense, the better, but the students of the UA Hell class always made it a point to celebrate their birthdays together. Did Izuku not want to celebrate with them? I'm sorry, the freckled face said, trying in vain to shield his embarrassed face from view as he shied away from the attention. My birthday has never been that big of a deal anyway. Not a big deal. Who was he kidding? Getting the rest of the class behind her plan had been easy. Tenya and Momo surprisingly jumped at the chance to plan a last-minute surprise party for Class 1A's resident greeneat. Even Bakugo, the annoying sourpuss he was, had quickly agreed, muttering about how the stupid nerd should be grateful for him doing his part in organizing the party. Sato had baked dozens of cupcakes, using Class 1B's dorm room ovens to make some of the best confections Ochako had ever seen. The whole of their sister class said they would be willing to keep Nedu on a leash to stop him from showcasing his qualities when it came time for the now inter-class surprise party. Sue was off to gather her younger siblings, partially because Eri wanted another playdate with her sister but also because her little brother had wanted to give Deku a birthday present after helping the young frog boy's school science project alongside Sue. Jiro was off putting together the perfect playlist for Deku's party, going so far as to imply more than a few songs would be perfect for someone, not saying any names, but for someone to confess his or her feelings towards someone who may or may not be the birthday boy. Ochako preferred to say nothing regarding the implication. Kaminari and Kirishima dragged Bakugo off to some swap meet to buy a limited edition All Might action figure, one of the few Deku didn't already own. Momo, Mina, and Toru had organized a massive food run, using Tenya and Shoji to haul the frankly disgusting amount of snacks and food from every supermarket and restaurant within a 10-mile radius. More than enough food to kill a horse, let alone dozens of growing heroes in training. So it would have been easy for them to stop by the charming bakery Momo recommended and pick up the 19-layered dark chocolate cake that Ochako had daydreamed about ever since the vice president mentioned it the day before. But here she was now, covered in flour and with chocolate running down her face and egg yolk filling her nostrils. For a moment, Ochako thought she could hear God laughing at her. What's going on? A voice broke through the haze of the anti-gravity user's thoughts like a punch to the gut. The soft voice, which typically was enough to calm whatever nerves Ochako had been feeling, scared her enough for her feet to leave the floor as she let out a rather unheroic eep from her lips. She turned to see the green-haired boy she had been thinking about, looking bewildered at the scene before him as if he was trying to figure out if a baking-themed supervillain had attacked them while he was out training. "Do you need any help there?" he asked. The moment his brain caught up to the situation had been instantaneous before shy little Izuku went into full hero mode once he saw someone in need. "You look like you're having a problem down there." The universe hated Ochako. "Oh, Deku," she stammered, trying hard to hide that she had been clearly baking a birthday cake for the unsuspected birthday boy and not doing very well. "What are you doing here?" "No, seriously, why was he here?" Sero, Ojiro, and Mineta were supposed to keep Deku occupied all morning to keep him away from the dorms. If Mineta screwed this up doing something perverted, Mineta had an assistant? Deku said, going on to explain that Mineta, being Mineta, mind you, had attempted to flirt with an upperclassman and had failed in a somewhat spectacular fashion. A quick trip to the infirmary later, Izuku had been ordered by Recovery Girl to take the future grape-colored superhero back to the dorms to heal up the face-numbing slap he had been given. But I'm here now, so I'm here to help with whatever you need. Some part of Ochako, who still really wanted to see Izuku's face when they all jumped out at him to scream, surprise, wanted to lie and tell him everything was fine. But a part of her knew she couldn't lie to save her life. But even if she couldn't lie to Deku. She might literally die if she did that. Thanks, Deku, she said shyly, looking as bashful as much as she was thankful for the assistance from her friend. I would appreciate the help. This whole baking was a lot harder than I thought. Sero does make it look easy, the boy said, whipping up egg yolk from the corner of the countertop with a rag. But I'm sure you'll get the hang of it with enough practice. Ochako smiled. The very thought of Izuku's warm green eyes and genuine smile was enough to make her feel warm and fuzzy inside. That's what she loved the most about her friend. Izuku might have been the most genuine person Ochako had ever met. While some tried to hide who they were with a tough front, Izuku seemed honest about who he was and what he was about. Not precisely the textbook definition of confidence, but one Ochako was more than willing to ascribe to the greenest boy in her class. I don't know what good deed I did to get you in my life, but I'm glad I did it, she said with a smile, her heart feeling like it was about to beat out of her chest. What was she thinking? Was she about to break her rule? Was this happening? Was she? Then why did you throw me away? Ochako stopped what she was doing, freezing on the spot like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truck. She couldn't breathe, her words dying in her mouth as she numbly took the sight of Deku staring at her with hatred in his eyes. It made her sick to even think about it. What? If you loved me so much, Izuku said, his eyes dark and tired, his voice dripping lower until it made Ochako feel like she was about to slip further into the cold dark void. A void that gripped tight around her limbs and pulled her down, like her quirk had suddenly turned against her body. She felt like a metronome, invisible forces pulling her back and forth as her vision became cloudy and dark. Why did you leave me to rot? She wasn't in the Heights Alliance dorm anymore, the dirty kitchen morphing and shifting into a dark jail cell. Thick iron bars mocking her widening eyes like a childhood bully picking and prodding to get a reaction out of her. I didn't, she tried to speak, her voice cracking as she gripped the bars tightly in her thin hands. The dark and grime of the dark iron seemed to shrink in her still flour-soaked fingers as she pulled with every ounce of strength in her body. I'm gonna help you. Help me? The voice was tired and broken, like pieces of broken glass scraping against a brick wall. The Deku she remembered, the one who showed her how to be a real hero, was replaced with a broken shell of a man. You ruined my life. He crashed against the iron bars so abruptly that Ochako was forced to retreat out of shock and fear. He was pale and thin, with dark bags that hung over his eyes and blood dripping from a busted lip and a broken nose. But his eyes captivated Ochako as if the life radiating from the boy's eyes had been sucked away. I didn't mean. You know what you did. His hoarse voice rasped out, his dead green eyes making Ochako's skin crawl as he spat his venomous words at her. She deserved this. She thought as she took a step back. This was her fault. Ochako felt her back against the stone wall of the cell block, the shadows growing closer and closer as they threatened to overwhelm her. But all she could do was look on as the eyes stared at her with more hatred than she thought was possible. If I knew how this would have turned out. He rasped again, turning away as he returned to the shadows, like a ghost drifting back into the void. I wouldn't have bothered to save you during the entrance exam. Uraraka stared unblinkingly at her alarm clock, counting down the seconds until the alarm would go off, signaling the start of her day. Ochako had always been the type of person who needed to hit the snooze button, often more than once, before she was awake enough to go about her daily routine. But nights like this were always the exception, when the last thing she wanted was to close her eyes and be alone with her thoughts. Nights where she couldn't stop thinking about Izuku. Nights where sleep was equal parts impossible and painful for her to go through. The sound of the alarm, one of those new pop groups that Mina had tried to get her to go see live, blazed to life, the big red 7 a.m. of her alarm almost mocking her as it did its job. It was funny to think about how her numbness now had a soundtrack to accompany it. As Ochako's sleep-deprived mind deciphered lyrics of true love and always being there for one another, there was only one thing Ochako could think about. How much she fucking hated herself. It wasn't a new feeling. In fact, it was one she had been quite intimate with these past few years, the nagging feeling in the back of her head that told her she deserved every bad thing that happened to her and that whatever good thing that popped into her life was an affront to the cruel universe that refused to punish her properly for her actions. She wasn't always like this. She wasn't even like this most of the time. But she could pretend to be happy. She could even trick herself into feeling like she was fine most days. She could post a meme to a group chat and be the friend her friends needed her to be. She could be the picture-perfect daughter, ensuring her parents could retire early and live the rest of their lives in comfort. She could corral and teach whatever intern she was assigned from her agency and do her duties as a hero as good, if not better, than anyone she's ever met. But it was all an act. In truth, she was a horrible person, just waiting for the time to arrive for whatever karma was around to finally get to her. She flipped the TV on. Some newscaster she couldn't remember the name of reporting a breakthrough in a cold case from back home that had stumped investigators for months, resulting in an immediate arrest. She wasn't paying much attention to it though. Ochako had rare enough days off, so she'd be damned if she spent her first day off in 2 weeks thinking about work, especially after the weekend from hell she had just finished. She had been explicitly called onto the case, chosen by name by the commission to oversee the search and rescue mission after a terrible rock slide had cut off a small mountain community an hour outside of Seoul. No casualties were reported then, but with dozens of hikers reported missing in the area and with entire miles of highway covered in dirt and stone, it was a race against time. In addition to the fact that only a handful of South Korean heroes had the necessary skill set and a quirk strong enough to help with the search and cleanup, international cooperation was essential to rectify the situation. Her specialties were search and rescue after all, and she had quickly become one of the best of her generation these past few years. Still, she'd be lying if she said being the representative of the Ryukyu agency while staying overseas in Seoul wasn't a lot on her plate. But Ochako knew this was an opportunity she couldn't pass up. It wasn't every day a heroine with less than 3 years on the job could network all over Asia after all. The HPSC, while the region's largest and most influential hero union and organization, had lost much of its influence and reputation on the world stage in the past few years, something they hoped an up-and-comer like Ochako could help with. 3 days may not sound bad, but spending every waking hour of those 3 days going through the motions of being a good representative for not just Ryukyu and her agency but for her country as a whole felt that much longer. The commission was very strict about that sort of thing, especially when during the few times they let one of their heroes cross into the borders of other heroes on the international hero circuit. She poured herself a cup of coffee, the cheapo instant blend her parents used whenever it was on sale and when they could buy it in bulk. It had a terrible aftertaste and Momo still didn't think it fit the legal definition of coffee, but it always reminded Ochako of home and back when she didn't feel like she did now. And after the weekend she had, that's exactly what she needed. Working 60 hours in 3 days may sound like a lot of work, but that was only because it was, especially when it involved moving and redirecting rocks the size of buses. She was there when search and rescue needed an extra body to crawl through the mud and dirt to drag anyone she could find to safety. She skipped meals to ensure there was enough food for the victims caught in the middle of the crosshairs. Overall, it was a miserable experience, but she was glad she could play a part in it, especially the dawn of the third day when a pathway for construction equipment had been cleared to the small mountain community. By the time Ochako had left the scene for the first time since her arrival, she wanted to take a 6-hour shower and sleep until next Christmas. But of course, nothing in her life could be that simple, as the nightmare she suffered through erased not only her desire to sleep but also awoken memories she had tried desperately to try and move on from. She had spent years trying and, more often than not, failing to not think about Deku. Which was difficult considering her profession. Being the best hero she could be had the unfortunate outcome of constantly thinking about the boy she had betrayed. The thought of what Deku would do if he was in a situation she was in had saved her life on more than one occasion. Whether it was battling a criminal or a natural disaster, the boy's memory was enough to get her through the most challenging days of her life. A fact that would often throw Ochako into yet another fit of dark depression the more she thought about it. Even now, after all these years, she was nothing more than a parasite, leeching off the boy's memory for her own benefit. She rarely thought about him now, her mind blocking him from her daily thoughts almost like a defense mechanism. But every once in a while, something reminded her of him, and every so often, she felt the need to crawl into her bed and wait for the feelings to pass. An overenergetic fan of hers asking for an autograph? The smile she got in response whenever she saved a grateful child from an accident? The rare times when she just craved the taste of katsudon out of the blue. Sometimes it was unavoidable, but that was just life sometimes. She didn't do anything illegal all those years ago, so this was the only punishment she would face for what she did. The feeling of thousands of invisible insects crawling all over her skin whenever she caught a glimpse of a specific shade of green, or the sleepless nights when she couldn't get his voice out of her head. None of it was enough for what she did, but it was all she would get. "I don't know about this, guys," Ochako said, shuffling her feet where she stood as all her classmates' collective eyes, except one, stared at her with unsure and unsteady eyes. "How can we be? We're not saying we believe it," Jiro said as she fiddled with her earphone jacks, a habit she always did when she felt uncomfortable. "But what if it's true? Can we be so sure about anything after everything we've been through so far?" Her words felt like a slap to Ochako's face. How could they believe what they were saying? Deku? A villain? None of it made any sense. She looked at the faces of the assembled students. Most of them seemed too lost in their own thoughts to pay much attention to anything at the moment. Did they really think? "They're investigating," Tenya said, his hands crossed over his chest as he stared at his feet, the ordinarily stiff and direct class president looking like he'd rather be anywhere but here. "I'm sure everything will be solved soon. But Aizawa wants us all to be careful around him until the investigation ends." "So what, we ignore him until this whole thing blows over?" Kirishima said from his spot on Ochako's bed. "We just pretend he doesn't exist? That doesn't sound very manly to me." Ochako didn't know why most of her class had appeared outside her bedroom door that night. In retrospect, she should have closed the door on them when Tenya asked to speak with her. Instead, she had a bad feeling about this whole thing, but she let her friends in against the wishes of the voice on her shoulder telling her not to. "We don't ignore him," Momo said, using every ounce of her big sis energy to try and calm the rest of their class. Momo was the smartest person Ochako had ever met, who thought of everything and anything regarding any and all possible outcomes. She was taking this seriously. "Then what do you want us to do?" Kaminari answered somewhat less calmly than he intended. It was clear that Kaminari was scared out of his wits regarding a possible mole in UA, considering how often he had Deku over at his house with the other guys to play video games. If the League had been gathering evidence about Kaminari's parents, "We treat him like we always do," Tenya answered, his tone more in control now than it was a moment ago. "We just do it more carefully now." "What's that even mean?" Sero asked from his position next to a quiet Shoto. The half-and-half hero had yet to say anything since he walked into the room. "So are you telling us to treat him like a threat?" "They're saying to not be alone with him," Sue said, her ordinarily stoic voice tinged with something that Ochako couldn't register. Was it contempt? But for who? "They say he's too dangerous to be alone until we sort this out." Azoiwa-sensei has mentioned that, yes. Tenya nodded, the room's atmosphere shifting with each word said. "Several staff members will be watching him from now on, and it would do us all good if we agreed not to get involved while they search for evidence." "You're saying you believe this?" Mina asked, the idea of the League of Villains knowing about her family life, making her pink skin crawl. "But Deku wouldn't do what they said he was doing, right?" "I'm just saying we need to take this seriously," Tenya answered, looking far stiffer than usual as if a strong enough wind could blow him over at any second. "What kind of heroes would we be if we didn't take these allegations seriously?" Ochako poured the contents of her coffee cup into the kitchen sink, no longer in the mood for coffee, as she threw herself back onto her hotel room bed. The cold and clammy feeling twisted into the pit of her stomach as she wrapped the comforter around her to fight back the chill. Her body felt numb as she wrapped her arms around herself to fight the encroaching chill. So hard and tight that, for a moment, she pretended that someone else was holding her, whispering that everything would be okay and they would get past this lapse in judgment together. Then, not for the first time, she thought of green eyes again, but the thought seemed to make the pain in her stomach grow, like someone twisting a knife in deeper. Thankfully for her, the beeping of her phone broke her out of her suffering, like a lifeline thrown to her as she drifted off in the middle of the sea. Her cheap little flip phone, the one she had since high school, was cracked and chipped. Its battery was on life support and barely held a charge these days. She could afford to buy a new one. She had bought her parents the latest models last Christmas, and it had barely made a dent in her Christmas bonus. But it still worked well enough for her, meaning she saw no reason to spend money when she didn't have to. 47 new messages. A bit more than usual, but Ochako hadn't been checking her phone for 3 days, the mountain range she was working at having a notoriously lousy reception, especially for devices that had long ago become obsolete. A few pictures from her parents enjoying their Hawaii vacation was saved and hearted, Ochako feeling content knowing that at least someone was enjoying themselves. She ignored the messages from Mina and Toru. Ochako needed to be more in the mood to handle their overly optimistic messages this early in the morning. Those two were the textbook definitions of an afternoon to early evening conversation. She saw Bakugo's name and instantly deleted the messages without reading them. She told him the last time she saw him that she didn't want to hear whatever he wanted to say to her. She felt terrible but tired of trying to be reasonable after so long. But, of course, it wasn't her fault that Katsuki only took a hint if someone was just as direct as he was. She scrolled down more, seeing a group message from her boss, the dragon heroine Ryukyu, regarding an emergency meeting that needed to be held, as soon as possible regarding a commission business. Unfortunately, the meeting had been postponed due to Ochako's trip. Still, it could only be held off for a bit longer, and she would need to come to the office Tuesday morning despite it being her day off. Ochako was annoyed, but her boss never did this, which only meant it was serious, or at the very least the commission thought so. Froppy, call me as soon as you can. Important. She eyed the message from Tsu, the pit in her stomach growing more cavernous as worry for her friend enveloped her. Then finally she returned to her texts from Mina and Toru, seeing their messages read "Call Tsu" in big bold letters. Had something happened? She dialed her friend's phone number, a part of her worried that her friend wouldn't pick up so early in the morning. She'd wake her best friend up early on a Monday morning all because she couldn't answer her messages. Some friend she was. But she was surprised to hear her friend's stoic voice after only a single ring, almost as if the rainy day heroine had been waiting for Ochako's call. Ochako? Her friend spoke, the same tone she used all those years ago when the truth of their shared mistake came to light. She couldn't see the frog girl's face, but she saw her big tear-filled green eyes. She could feel the tremors in her friend's voice and hear the stress in her voice. Sorry about all the messages. Tenya wanted to be the one to call you, but... What's wrong, Tsu? Ochako spoke, her voice barely above a whisper as she waited for her friend to talk. Had something happened? Was someone hurt? What's going on? Bakugo was in the hospital. Tsu said, her stoic voice wavering for a slight moment before returning to normal. Something happened to him early Saturday morning and well? Is he okay? Ochako asked. Her feelings toward her ex were complicated, to say the least. He's not hurt, is he? It wasn't that she hated him. After all, whatever sins could be laid at his feet could be applied equally to Ochako's own. But whatever romantic feelings she may or may not have had towards the explosive user were dead and gone. It was just a fling she had been convinced by friends to go along with, and one she really didn't want a repeat performance with, despite his reluctance to let it go and move on. But she certainly didn't want him to get injured. She could feel regret slowly grow at the thought of the messages from him she had just deleted. If she had known. He's fine. Just had a bit of a stress attack. Tsu said, sounding like the cold-blooded woman had a lot on her mind, like Tsu was working herself up to something she didn't want to discuss. This isn't about him though. Before he got released from the hospital, he called all of us together to tell us something. Tsu was a lot of things to many people, but she wasn't someone who often got tongue-tied in stressful situations. The fact that her best friend seemed so scared to say what was on her mind was equally confusing as it was scary for Ochako to witness. What happened? Izuku. Tsu croaked, a fresh sob escaping her throat as she broke into another round of tears. He's back. Izuku Midoriya. All Might shouted, his voice like a roar of a lion as he gripped the neck of his arch-nemesis. Say it. Ochako felt her heart break again as she felt the emotion and grief in the man's voice. Yet even now, All Might believed in Midoriya's innocence, which seemed to shake the foundations of Ochako's worldview. Had no one told him? Had he yet to see the evidence they had seen? Ochako knew. She knew what she did was the right thing. So she had no choice but to push her feelings aside and do what needed to be done to stop the villain's plans. Izuku had been a villain and needed to be stopped, right? She numbly walked closer to the electronic display. The only electronics store in the abandoned and bombed-out city street had been gutted by looters and destroyed from the weeks of constant fighting. But one TV screen, cracked and overturned, remained plugged in, the emergency broadcast blaring to life just a moment before. The war was over and the heroes had won. The Paranormal Liberation Army was in retreat, and Ochako should have felt a wave of relief fill her body at the thought. But for some reason she felt like she was staring into the abyss, just waiting for something to happen within the dark void and feeling like something was preparing to drag her down into the darkness. She couldn't see the reactions of her classmates. The rest of 2A were scattered throughout the city as they helped bring justice to those who deserved it. But she knew they were all watching what she was watching. How could they not? The whole world must have been watching, and despite the chaos around her, nothing else seemed to matter to Ochako at that moment. Not the bloody gash on Ochako's thigh or the cuts littering her face. She felt like she was standing on top of a cliff, taking step after step until she was overlooking the edge, confusion slowly transforming into desperation. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop what it was doing as Ochako slowly walked closer to the cracked screen of the television monitor. "Ochako?" She heard a familiar voice speak her name, but the hero student paid her little mind. She watched as the king of evil spoke, laughing at the chaos and destruction he had caused, reviling in what would become his legacy for countless generations. The man who almost overthrew the world and nearly destroyed hero society. But the man smiled as he slowly died, joyfully mocking the man who had made his empire crumble. He did not speak of revenge against the symbol of peace or those who fought alongside him, nor did he threaten or curse his own failures. Because even now, even when the man was at death's door, he had one last act of violence to enact. "You all did such a wonderful job." His voice was soft and haggard as All Might gripped his vast hands to the man's throat, but it was like knives to Ochako's ears as she tried to steady herself on the crumbling wall of the alleyway. Ochako knew in her heart the monster on screen wasn't speaking to her, but she certainly felt that he was. It felt harder to breathe. Ochako slowly felt like her limbs were growing heavier and heavier with each passing moment. She blew air from her nose, the sound of a wounded animal trying desperately to keep a predator away from her, overcoming the numbness of her hearing. Her heart hitched, pumping faster and faster until it felt like her chest was about to cave in on itself. She bit her tongue, swallowing a sob as she watched the monster in front of her mocking her for what she did. What she did? She was trembling now, her body shivering under the warm spring sun like it was in the heart of winter. She wrapped her arms around her shoulders, her instincts screaming at her to run and hide and to block out the words she was being forced to hear. This couldn't be happening. They told Ochako this wasn't possible. They had shown her the evidence. They said they were 100% sure about it. She wouldn't have done this otherwise. Why would they lie to her? "Ochako," she heard the voice of her former senpai and former member of UA's Big Three speak out to her. "Calm down. Everything is going to be okay." The bombed-out ruins of the city block were empty save for the UA second-year student and the recently graduated and debuted Nijire-chan and their latest capture, but none of that seemed to matter to Ochako at the moment. She felt the voice of All for One slither into her ear, like a snake burying itself into the nest of its prey, each word like a needle jammed into her eardrums. Ochako could say nothing as she listened to the man's laughter and the look of hatred pass over the face of All Might. It was true, it was all true. She had done all this for nothing. She had, oh God. Ochako dropped to her knees, Nijire rushing to ensure the gravity user didn't fall onto her face as her knees gave out. But despite the blue-haired young woman's best efforts, Ochako could not take her eyes from what she saw or heard like a small animal caught in the headlights of its oncoming death. She cried and struggled in the arms that held her, shrieking like some wounded animal trying to escape the bear trap that tore through her limbs and muscles, the taste of her tears mixing with the copper of the blood of her busted lip, melding together into a cocktail of pain and grief. She didn't deserve to live. "Ochako!" Nijire shouted, her grip barely holding the younger woman in place as more and more surrounding heroes and police flocked to their location. Some moved to help the struggling woman, while most moved to take the captured and defeated villain away. But through the pain and haze of confusion, all she could see now was the smiling face of the villain she had defeated but a moment ago. Her moment of victory over Toga Himiko now forever tainted by the truth of her actions a year prior. "I always knew I loved Deku more than you," Toga shouted, her manic laughter still audible even through the broken bones and punctured lungs. Her eyes were bright red as she stared into Ochako's soul, almost daring her to say something. "Because I would never betray him." She spoke in an almost sing-song rhythm, taunting Ochako through blood and broken teeth, not bothering to struggle as she was taken away. Ochako stopped moving, every muscle in her body going limp as she fell into the waiting arms of Nijire. She sobbed and cried, beating her hands into the ground until they were broken and raw, begging anyone listening for this to make what was happening make sense to her. "You call yourself a hero?" Toga said as she was hoisted into the padded police car, her crazed smile never leaving her face. She looked almost happy despite everything, looking almost vindicated by the outcome of Ochako's victory. "You never deserved him." As the scene repeatedly played on a loop, the dying villain's mocking laughter, making her feel like she was being skinned alive. Was this what winning felt like? Like a dagger through her heart? But as Ochako's cries died out, her eyes red and puffy as her cheeks became stained from her tears, the only thing Ochako could think about was Izuku, and how she didn't deserve to call herself a hero. Ochako dropped her phone and stumbled backward, hitting the wall as she tried to escape the memory. She could hear Tsu call out to her, but Ochako paid her friend little mind as she squeezed her eyes shut, but the images seemed burned into her mind. The ghost of Deku she had held onto for this long whispered into her ear before Ochako fell to her knees. You know what you did. It's just a dream, Ochako whispered to herself, shaking back and forth as she raised her hands to her head. It's just a dream. She calmed herself, the mantra she had used these 5 years to beat back the nightmares working as she slowly regained control of her breathing and her sobs slowly disappeared. You weren't worth the hassle, he rasped once more, his raspy voice overshadowing Tsu's now panicked and confused voice on the phone. I shouldn't have bothered saving you. She ignored the voice and stood back up, picking her discarded phone into her hand as she tried to regain control of her emotions. Her face was puffy and red, but her voice regained much of its usual strength before she took a deep breath and spoke again. Tell me everything we know so far. How good could the Garden of Eden be if a snake was already there? Izuku always tried to look on the bright side of life whenever he was at his lowest. Call him a masochist if you want, call him naive, call him stupid and brain-dead regarding how life tends to treat him. All those descriptions would be accurate, but he can't help but try to see the glass as half full instead of half empty. Izuku always hated that particular fact about him, a personality quirk that affected his life more than anything else he could think about. More so than his crippling anxiety or his penchant to try to brute force himself through his problems despite his relatively high intelligence. It certainly affected his life more so than his ability to make friends. Izuku always feared that if it weren't for others looking towards him, either out of pity or genuine affection, his shyness would have forced the life of a hermit onto Izuku long before the crushing weight of his failed dreams broke whatever friendships and relationships he used to have. Way more than the crippling loneliness that kept Izuku up at night wondering from dusk till dawn about what he could have done differently that one time Katsuki knocked him out in the 3rd grade during a game of dodgeball and how it was clearly Izuku's fault for not letting Katsuki's ball hit him when the explosion user wanted it to. But despite all the negativity, Izuku always seemed to look on the bright side of things. Sure, the whole of hero society is in the shitter right now, public opinion and trust in societal institutions the lowest they have ever been due to no unsubstantial part being the cause of Izuku's entire life being ruined half a decade ago with all his friends and loved ones either turning their backs on him or taking open enjoyment in his misery. Still, at least he had his health, right? Right? Izuku muttered, letting the room's stillness overtake him. It was 6 o'clock on a rainy autumn Monday morning, the gray sky spilling over into a light mist that made Izuku feel the drawbacks of his limited sleep schedule. He deposited the armful of half-off convenience store beef bowls he carried home during his pre-dawn shopping spell, the plastic containers feeling like a well-earned treasure hoard to the money-strapped would-be hero. He hadn't slept the night before because, well, it turns out sleeping is difficult when you find out that the Hero Commission, the same governing body whose hoops Izuku had to jump through to be a hero in the first place, was currently investigating him for the crimes he was arrested for 6 years ago that he still hasn't been officially cleared of wrongdoing yet. It certainly made the late-night escapades and his early morning errands that much more interesting, but beyond the additional endorphins high, the thought of potentially going back to Tartarus for something he didn't do didn't make Izuku feel that much different than he usually did. That might be because he just generally felt like shit when working a case. Lack of sleep and a diet consisting of whatever junk food Izuku could get from vending machines did wonders for his mental state after all. Still, thankfully, that convenience store worker whom he saved from a holdup the night before had been the guardian angel Izuku desperately needed in his time of need. The mountain of nutritious mouth-watering treasures she offered him more than enough to put the negative thoughts of what he would need to do to combat the HPSC on the back burner for the time being. Eating cup ramen multiple times a day may have sounded fun when he was in middle school, but when one needed to consume 250 grams of protein a day to maintain his weight, the whole ordeal became too much to stomach on most days. At least that's one less thing I get to worry about, Izuku said to himself as he sat at his desk, his office chair groaning as he threw himself down. Now I have all day to think of what the hell I will do with my real problems. The commission had opened an investigation on him, nothing official yet, but if what Endeavor and Shoto had told him last night was true, then at the very least, every top 10 hero agency in the country knew he was back in town and had been warned to keep away from him. Not that he had much to worry about that. Being a freshly minted hero who hadn't even had a full business day under his belt meant the higher-ups of the Japanese hero food chain either didn't have time to worry about him or, at the very least, had far more important things to spend their day with the smallest of the small fries, so low down the totem pole he wasn't even officially ranked yet. He supposed he could wait until next week when the Hero Commission updated their rankings when Izuku's debut was publicly mentioned. But why did Izuku have to wait to hear what he already knew? Bottom of the fucking barrel, Izuku thought to himself, his mind racing to the image of the number 1 and number 10 hero going out of their way to speak with him the night before. their appearance and attention enough to make the small police station he was working out of at the time stand still in shock and awe. Shoto? There were a lot of complicated emotions running through his head about seeing his friends after so long. They didn't share many words together, but Izuku figured the shock and awkwardness of the situation played more into their meeting's lack of substance than they wanted. It was good to see him, or at least it was good to see that he was physically fine after all the stuff with the half-and-half hero's older brother during the war. A part of Izuku wanted to hug the guy, but this other half of Izuku didn't trust being around the two-toned hero longer than a couple of minutes without either saying or doing something he would regret. I guess that's what happens when you ignore all your problems. Izuku thought to himself as he opened his breakfast's first pre-packed beef bowl. Everything comes out all at once and you become a pariah. Izuku often wondered how life would have ended if he hadn't immediately left Japan after his release from Tartarus. Where would he be now if he had managed to get back into UA? Maybe he'd be in the top 10 by now. His mom may have never returned home to Japan, but he may have been able to re-establish whatever friendships he may or may not have had with his classmates. Hell, maybe he could sleep for over a few hours without waking up in a cold sweat. Probably not. Despite Izuku's insistence on looking at the bright side of things regarding where his life was and why he was in the position he was in now, the pessimist that Izuku had slowly become over the years knew that he would likely still be on the commission radar had he remained. Despite whatever positives his life could have had, Izuku knew in his heart that he'd still be between the rock and the hard place he was in now, regardless of whatever choice he made all those years ago. Still, at this point, Izuku wasn't sure if the commission hated him because they still thought he was the League of Villains mole, the whole fiasco during the mass breakout of Tartarus, or any of the other fun stuff Izuku managed to get himself involved in during these past 5 years. It was the dealer's choice by this point. No need to worry about the past. Izuku's mind raced back down to familiar and well-walked terrain, familiar words and images gracing his memories as he felt himself slowly drift away from the waking hours and into the dark thoughts that seemingly only haunted him. Whenever he slept. Not when the present has its own shit you have to worry about. Izuku knew the moment he landed back home from America, his paperwork filled and his legal challenges against the Hero Commission as researched as a ground invasion of enemy territory, that the HPSC would not take his injunction lying down. They didn't much care for him when he was a kid who did nothing to them, let alone an adult who spent the past few years of his world tour throwing up his middle finger at the attempts to control him. It didn't matter how many hero unions they chased him out of. It didn't matter how many legal challenges they put forward against those who offered him safe passage. It didn't matter much to Izuku how or why they even wanted him on their payroll after this long. All that mattered now was that Izuku would keep doing what he was doing one day at a time. And if that meant closing down his office on a Monday, on what would have been the Dikairu Hero Agency's first official day of business if he hadn't decided to get an early start to his official hero career over the weekend, to collect his thoughts for the battle ahead properly, then so be it. Besides, it wasn't like he hadn't already had a productive weekend. The pile of unfinished paperwork from the dozen or so crimes he apprehended or worked on still needed to be finished and submitted before he could be appropriately paid. It wasn't like he could afford a secretary to do the boring stuff with the zero money he had in his checking account. The last of Izuku's petty cash would have been spent on food to last him the rest of the week if he hadn't been gifted the beef bowls that covered his desk. But that was the thing about finding himself where he was now. There was no place to go but up when you hit rock bottom. It's not like things could get any worse, right? Katsuki Bakugo, the number 15 professional hero known to all of Japan as Grown Zero, was in a foul mood as he patrolled the early morning streets. Katsuki ignored the passers-by as he walked past, ignored the judging looks of civilians who didn't entirely trust him the way they trusted heroes when he was a kid, ignored the pit in his stomach that made him want to break some unfortunate villain's jaw, and ignored the feeling of apprehension that threatened to overwhelm him if he let it. Monday mornings always sucked, but this particular Monday morning seemed to suck that much more than every other one Katsuki had forced himself out of bed to experience. The commuters on their way to work were more annoying than usual, with the stench of cheap black coffee and old cigarette smoke clinging to their bodies as they shambled their way to and fro. School kids were more annoying than usual, their weekend sleep schedule conflicting with the early morning hike they made to the prison they called a school, grumbling their dumb asses to anyone who could hear whatever watered-down teenage angst the kids thought they were going through. Don't even get Katsuki started on villains and criminals, because on a Monday morning like this, even the lowlives that Katsuki had to interact with seemed even worse than usual. As if they had all gotten together for Sunday brunch and decided amongst themselves in between bottomless Bloody Marys and overpriced omelets to be the most significant pieces of shit they could possibly be at the coming start of the week just to piss Katsuki off, and it was working. I said. Katsuki roared as he raised his gauntlet fist into the air, bringing it down with a thud to the face of the wanted criminal. Stop resisting. The man's head bounced like a ball, the fight leaving his body like an exorcised ghost leaving for the afterlife. It was supposed to be a routine traffic stop, but of course on a day like this, where everyone thought their problems were so much more important than everyone else, the perp just had to make the whole thing worse. A fire-breathing quirk that wasn't particularly powerful in the grand scheme of things but more than enough to make the rookie cop writing the traffic ticket take a step back in shock when he felt the top of his head start smoking. By the time Katsuki had arrived on the scene, the perp had injured 2 others, including a dumb kid who was in the wrong place at the wrong time on his way to middle school. No one puts their hands on kids in Katsuki's town, certainly not some dumb fuck who was willing to hurt civilians over a $50 traffic ticket. Get him out of here, Katsuki called over his shoulder, the police on the scene hoisting the now fireless hot head away from the scene. He walked away without turning back as the stunned rookie police officer he had saved still looked at him with awe etched on his face, hitting the pavement with the annoyance of a man who didn't know where he was going but knew he had to be there soon. The city of Mizutofu, his hometown, was, frankly, just how it had always been, with an overwhelming sense of stillness and sterile cleanliness that clung to the city since its revitalization all those years ago. The war with the Meta Liberation Army, if you could call a bunch of dumb fuck quirk racists an army and their acts of violence and terrorism against the civilian population in their insane attempt to overthrow the government a war, had been devastating for the city. Businesses that Katsuki remembered when he was a kid had shuttered their doors, and restaurants he remembered his parents taking him for his birthdays were replaced with unfamiliar names that sold unfamiliar food. Even the movie theater where Katsuki saw his first movie, All Might vs. the Forces of the Dark Dimension 3, this time it was personal, had long since closed and replaced with some boring-looking office building rented out by some old guy with cheap body spray who yelled at his employees whenever he showed up to work drunk. Katsuki hated that fucking guy, but Katsuki hated the sense that everything that he loved when he was a kid had slowly begun to change, and there was nothing he could do about it. The city had been so vibrant back then, but now it felt sterilized, more like a museum than a living city. But beyond that, there was one thing about this city that seemingly drove Katsuki up a wall whenever he thought about it for more than a moment. No matter how much it changed, the town of Mizutofu reminded Katsuki of Midoriya. Katsuki shook his head, looking less like a professional hero he watched on TV as a kid and more like a Pomeranian with water stuck in its ear as he tried to forget about the boy. The moment passed, and Katsuki was back to his usual aggravated self, ignoring a group of kids as they tried to get his attention for an autograph. That was really ground zero. That's so cool. One voice cried out, excitement radiating from his voice like a firecracker ready to explode. Do you think he's too busy? A small voice spoke out, his words inaudible to the excited babble of his friends. Of course he's busy, stupid. He's probably on his way to fight some villain or something. The first voice spoke, the leader of the group of children snapping at his subordinate with the seriousness of what a general does to his soldiers. Hey you little ankle biters. Katsuki spat out, his voice shocking the kids where they stood. Don't talk to your friend like that. He was just asking you a question. You got that? The children looked stunned, frozen at being spoken to by an honest-to-God hero or because said hero had told them off. Katsuki didn't know, nor did he particularly. Kare. He walked away, the image of the kids sticking in the back of his head longer than he would have liked. Stupid fucking kids treating their stupid fucking friends like shit, he muttered as he pushed himself away from his public, a smattering of firecrackers sending them into a fresh round of applause as he did so. Don't they have school to go to? But why is Katsuki here? Doing shitty traffic heroism like some glorified first-year work-study trainee? Because someone did him a favor. When he arrived at work this morning, his boss and the entire legal division of their agency legal division already occupied his private office at the Best Jeans Hero Agency. Legally speaking, I cannot allow you to be within 10 blocks of Izuku Midoriya knowingly. The denim-based superhero said simply, his words feeling like a bucket of ice-cold water to the explosion user's ears. Until further notice, I need you grounded from active duty and on desk duty. Excuse me? Did they think this was a joke? Was his career a joke? Who the hell did the commission think they were? After every shitty fucking thing they have done, they go and do this shit. They were afraid of what? That Katsuki couldn't work with Deku? That Katsuki was too much of a loose cannon who couldn't get over himself for long enough to be in the same room with Deku because they think he's gonna snap? No. Katsuki thought, his feet leading him to a familiar spot in town he had never been to. None of this is about you. It's about Deku. Katsuki wanted to assure his boss that he had nothing to worry about Deku, that the guy had already suffered enough and didn't deserve a fresh round of shit to be dropped on him or to rehash old wounds. But no one listened. The office hadn't even appropriately opened yet, and the halls were already abuzz with the news, whispers and rumors flying like bullets out of a war zone. By the time Katsuki rounded the corner between his office door and the agency exit, Katsuki already had a list a mile long of guys he worked with who needed their asses beat as soon as possible. But it wasn't just the warning he received from his boss that seemed to rattle Katsuki's thoughts, but the piece of paper the denim hero had slipped him of an address near downtown Yuzurifu. Beast Genus didn't say whose address it was, but Katsuki knew in his heart of hearts who he would find there. Which was why he was such a pussy about going there. What other reason would someone like him get stopped by a fender bender, for God's sake? If he was a real man, he'd be at Deku's address right now, begging on all fours like the dog Katsuki was for his forgiveness and helping him like the friend he should have done all those years ago. But Katsuki was a coward, one entirely too afraid to even knock on that man's door out of fear that Izuku Midoriya, the boy whose life he had ruined, the boy who he had tortured and taken immense glee out of doing, that the same boy would answer that door and look at him with the seething hatred Katsuki knew he deserved. Katsuki refused. He refused to be a villain again. "You looked like you needed some help, Casey-chan." The almost squeaky high voice of the little boy broke Katsuki out of his confusion and discomfort, the boy staring down at him with his hand extended. "You're not hurt, are you?" The pain of his scraped knee was forgotten for a moment as Katsuki could do nothing but stare into the eyes of the green-haired boy smiling down at him, his thin fingers and trembling hand crisscrossed with thin cuts and the mud of the river bed. Katsuki was the strongest kid in their class, the one with the best quirk and the one everyone looked towards when things got rough, and Deku's first instinct was to check if Katsuki was okay instead of standing by the tree line and whispering to himself like the rest of the boys they were with. Why would he need Deku's help? Katsuki's eyes lingered on the other boys for a second until two little voices broke out from above his head. Katsuki didn't remember their names. At this point he could barely remember what those kids looked like or what they said to him, but he remembered how their words made him feel. Small. Weak. Someone who needed to be protected instead of the guy who did the protecting. The type of person who needed to rely on others for help couldn't be a number one hero, and Katsuki was going to be the number one hero. And the number one hero didn't need wimps like Deku to help him do anything, right? Katsuki said nothing, staring up at the distinguished business plaque near the office building entrance, the name of the "We Can Do Anything" Dikairu Hero Agency on the office plaquette, staring up at him like a mocking joke told by God himself at Katsuki's expense. The name brought back some uncomfortable thoughts in the young man's head, a panic attack similar to the one who dropped him off at the hospital just a few days previous, threatening to overwhelm him once more, but Katsuki rode the wave. He gripped his hands into fists so hard that he felt the sensation of blood drip between his white knuckles, his jaw clenching as he overpowered his anxiety out of pure spite and will. "Fuck this shit," he said, knocking on the entrance door and praying to God that the man he was looking for wasn't home. "The Dikairu Hero Agency is closed for the day," an unfamiliar voice broke through from behind the office door, the strained politeness of a salaried worker covering up the clear annoyance the person must have felt at being interrupted before the small agency in front of Katsuki could officially open for the day. "If you have potential business, please call tomorrow to schedule an appointment. I'm here to see Izuku Midoriya," Katsuki said gruffly. It was already too early in the morning to be dealing with some pencil pusher. "If he's here, open up. If he's not, tell me where he is." "What do you want, Bakugo?" The same unfamiliar voice rang out, the friendly tone replaced with a deep baritone that wouldn't sound out of place during a thunderstorm. "Deku?" Katsuki spoke, his voice a harsh whisper at the realization of his former friend's voice, the mental image he had held of the boy shattering instantly as his mind raced to think of a face to go with the voice. Katsuki didn't know what he expected to see when he came here. He was half expecting to see Izuku Midoriya, unaged from the day the explosion user last saw him, all 15 years of age and filled with the nervous energy that often seemed to be infused into the boy's bloodstream during the early days of their life. Katsuki instantly craned his neck downward, the memory of looking down on the shorter teen ingrained into his muscles by this point. "Keikakeshi-chan?" he would say, his voice cracking from the strain and surprise. "What are you doing here?" That was not what he received. The door to the office slid open, revealing a man as familiar to Katsuki as he was a complete stranger to him, taller than Katsuki by more than a few inches and as broad as the door frame. His green hair was cropped on the sides of his head and pulled back into a messy bun that hung loosely against his thick neck. His freckles were gone, or at the very least he couldn't notice them through the myriad of scars that littered his face and the scruff of newly grown facial hair. But it wasn't until Katsuki saw the man's eyes, the identical green emeralds that once shone with tears whenever he got excited or had been overwhelmed with emotion, staring down at him blankly like he was just another guy on The street that Katsuki knew who it was he was staring at. Can I help you? Midoriya spoke, leaning his colossal frame against the door frame, the simple t-shirt with the English word for hoodie, straining against it despite the XXL etched on its tag. His tone was polite and composed but held no other emotion, not even the annoyance that Katsuki had heard before. Katsuki had never felt indifference before. Being a polarizing figure even before his debut, he had become accustomed to admiration and dislike in equal measure. But this felt different. Can I come in? Katsuki asked, his voice subdued despite the storm brewing in his mind, his body moving on autopilot as his mind tried to make sense of the situation. I need to speak to you. A voice in the back of Katsuki's mind screamed at him, had both the stupidity of thinking coming here was a good idea and the arrogance it took for someone to hope the decision would turn out well for him in the end. It was the same voice Katsuki had heard in his lowest moments, the whisper in the dark over the rumble of the applause and the voice that sang his darkest thoughts to him on the nights he could not sleep. What did you think was going to happen? He heard the voice creep back up. After all this, that he wanted to see you? The green-haired man said nothing, his green eyes shining with complicated feelings as he leaned into the doorframe. Katsuki once thought he could have read his old friend like a book, but the man his friend had grown up into seemed far more guarded than Katsuki ever thought possible for the boy he remembered. So lost in thought, Katsuki didn't even notice that the man in front of him had moved to allow him entry into the small office space, chiding himself slightly as he made his way inside, stopping as he heard the room door close. Welcome to the Dikairu Hero Agency, where we can do anything you need us to do, the man said, with a practiced smile on his face that dropped the moment he finished speaking, the annoyance he spoke with returning with full force as Katsuki entered through the doorway. So what can I do for the famed Ground Zero? The room was small, sparsely decorated with a set of well-used yet well-maintained leather armchairs and couch encircled around one of those cheapo box store coffee tables directly across from where Katsuki stood, the closed window blinds keeping the early morning from enveloping the room. He saw a coffee maker on one of the corner tables, one of the cheap ones Katsuki half assumed came as a bonus for signing the renter's agreement for this particular building, several identical-looking coffee mugs set next to it. He thought he saw a framed poster of All Might smiling with thumbs up, declaring the reader to hang in there, near the corner of the room behind some boxes. It was nothing compared to the office Katsuki had at Best Jeanist Heroics Agency, not even close, but Katsuki couldn't help but feel a bit envious over what he saw. Katsuki had lucked out when he graduated, having worked extensively with the now number 1 and newly ranked number 3 heroes during his time at school, making his generous contract when he stepped out into the hero business proper less of a surprise and more of a formality. He would never have to worry about keeping the lights on or making rent for the office space, or even making sure the paperwork of his arrests and heroic actions were filled out correctly, having an entire support staff of dozens who spent the entirety of their day making sure that Katsuki's day ran smoothly. But to see Midoriya, lacking all those same little privileges that Katsuki took for granted, after all the bullshit he had suffered through and all the struggle he must have been through, making his own way in the world? It was a tad humbling. I was in the area on patrol, Katsuki said, watching Midoriya make a pot of coffee as he shuffled into the room like an autopilot. I heard you were in town and wanted to see you. Shoto told you? Hell no, I knew about you before Icy Hot. Katsuki spat out, annoyed at the implication that not only did that half-and-half bastard know before he did, but that Shoto had tried to speak with Izuku before Katsuki himself had the chance to. I heard your name while on patrol. The human trafficking ring at the pachinko parlor, that was you, right? You mean Pachinko Palace? Yeah, that was me. Izuku started, his analytical mind running through every detail of the investigation like a sentient Wikipedia page as efficiently as someone would discuss the weather. Wouldn't have been able to catch them if I hadn't gotten lucky and broke up an attempted strong arm at a hostess club a few blocks away. Yeah, I ran into your handiwork while you were across town, Katsuki answered back, less on purpose and more for the momentum of the conversation forcing him to speak. The longer they chatted about whatever bullshit Katsuki could think up, the more time he had to psych himself up to where he needed to be mentally to say to Midoriya what needed to be said. It was impressive. I think we've had enough pleasantries, don't you think? The green-haired man said with a flat tone to his voice as if the early morning made it difficult for him to keep up the facade of a person who didn't hate Katsuki's guts. What is it you want with me? The words were firm and to the point, enough that Katsuki felt the room spin around him. He didn't know how this day would end, but it had already started on a worse foot than he would have wanted. Listen, Midoriya, Katsuki began cringing as he caught himself from saying the name Deku out loud. I came here to say that you're sorry? For a moment, Katsuki didn't know what was happening. His head was a blur of heated thoughts and dark memories, a lifetime of regret and shitty decisions rushing through his head like a mad bull crashing through a storefront selling those shit anime figurines Kirishima loved. Katsuki had forced himself to come here, ground his teeth with each step he took, and squeezed his fist so tight he thought he had drawn blood more than once. He had stared down terrorists and murders, the worst criminal scum the Japanese underground had to offer, and did it with a smirk on his face and a "go fuck yourself" on his lips. But for his life, those 3 little words nearly brought him to his knees. "Is that what you came down here for? To apologize or something?" Izuku said, weariness and annoyance tinging his voice as he ran his scared hands through the 5 o'clock shadow of his face. "You know you didn't have to do that, right?" "What? I guess I was sort of expecting this to happen. I saw Shoto last night. He wanted to say a lot to me, but I guess he couldn't bring himself to do it," Izuku said, looking almost embarrassed that he had seemingly read the explosion user's mind as quickly as an open book. "I could tell he wanted to say something but he just—" Izuku paused momentarily, his thoughts freezing whatever words he was prepping himself to say, freezing on his lips. "I figured something like this would have happened eventually. Not this soon but still." For a moment, the 2 men just stood there, looking at the other and hoping that the other would say something to break the weird tension that filled the room. "Listen, Bakugo. I know this is weird and we never had the best relationship. But I don't blame you for how things happened," Izuku said, his words sounding like the green-haired man was forcing them up from deep inside his soul. "We're just a kid. We all were. You guys followed the adults you were supposed to trust, and for that—" Izuku took a deep breath, the beginning frames of a panic attack slowly overwhelmed by Izuku's sheer willpower and desire. The green-haired man stifled a sob as if the act of officially putting his past trauma behind him was almost painful for him to do. But did it he did, taking a step forward and wrapping his arms around Bakugo's shoulders in an awkward hug that left Katsuki feeling like he had been struck by a truck. It was quick, less of a hug and more Izuku pressing his shoulder to Katsuki, but it was definitely physical contact. A part of Katsuki wanted to lean into the move, but his arms hung limply to his sides, his brain not fully working correctly even to know what or even why this was happening. "I don't hate you, Bakugo, and I forgive you for what you did," Izuku muttered to himself, the emotional drain making the young man look like he had aged half a decade within a few single moments as he let go of his former classmate and friend, feeling a weight that Izuku had held for years melting off of him as he did so. But Katsuki wanted nothing more than to slap that look of relief off his face at that moment. Katsuki stood there limply, his arms hanging loose to his side with whatever energy he had in his body gone as he stared at the green-haired young man. Izuku? Forgave him? That was it. Katsuki had spent 10 years bullying Izuku, making the young man's life a living hell with daily beatings and insults that left the shorter boy in tears or as close to tears as those asshole teachers they had let him before they sent Izuku to the principal's office for distracting the rest of the class. It wasn't an isolated occurrence, something that could be chalked up to a little kid being the little dipshit most kids are. It wasn't a one-time event where he realized right then and there that he was hurting another kid for no reason and deciding not to do that anymore like a normal fucking person would. It was every day for 10 years when Katsuki made it his daily mission to make Midoriya feel like he was lower than dirt and to ensure he knew precisely what Katsuki thought about him. The fact that Katsuki only seemed to get worse, doing things that made that lifetime of torment and abuse look like a walk through the park, made him want to scream and shout and give the man before him a reason to hate him. To be the bad guy in Izuku Midoriya's eyes the way he deserved to be. "You okay there, Ground Zero?" Midoriya asked, concern evident in his voice as he looked towards the higher-ranked hero for confirmation that his words were heard, let alone understood. "You're being quiet? Got something on your mind?" Did Katsuki have something on his mind? Deku had the gall to ask him that after everything that had happened. Of fucking course, Katsuki had shit on his mind. Katsuki spent years tearing himself apart, countless sleepless nights spent going over every bad thing he did in his life, and drinking himself stupid to numb the inner thoughts that cut him deeper than knives. Katsuki ruined Midoriya's life. Katsuki either ruined nearly every interpersonal relationship he had personally or at least played a hand in almost everything wrong that happened in Izuku's life. All for what? Because Bakugo's ego had been so fragile that he was willing to believe that a guy who had done nothing wrong to anyone in his life was literally a villain before the thought that Katsuki was mistaken or misinformed about something even crossed his stupid fucking head. Katsuki had repeatedly torn his hair out of his head, thinking about what he would say if this moment had ever happened, jumping at the first chance he would have received to admit he was wrong and beg for forgiveness, but Deku just forgave him? He was the bigger man and swallowed whatever resentment and anger he felt for what had happened and just What gave Midoriya the fucking right to do that? Katsuki choked back, the bile rising to his throat as he watched his former childhood friend stand in front of him, the slight smile on his face making Katsuki feel numb as if his entire body had just shut down. Katsuki felt twitchy, his palms sweaty, and his throat became dry. But despite the panic attack, he knew what was currently happening. He just couldn't bring himself to look away from the young man in front of him. Listen, Bokugo. I know we don't like each other too much, but that doesn't change the fact that we're both heroes, the man said, walking closer to the explosive user, his eyes never wavering from Katsuki's own. We're not kids anymore and we can't let something from our past affect our present, let alone our future. Katsuki said nothing, staring intently at the other man's hands, the steaming black beverage like an olive branch offered to an enemy to avoid potential bloodshed erupting between two rival kingdoms. The good King Deku, what a fucking joke. They both knew Katsuki didn't deserve mercy, not for what he said or did. Katsuki deserved to be scorned and shunned, hated for years of abuse and neglect, and forced to carry the anchor of his sins. He had prepared himself for the long years of atonement to prove he was beyond the red marks of his past, but the offered forgiveness was enough to drive Katsuki off a wall. Stupid fucking Deku. With a roar, Katsuki stepped forward, slapping the offered cup of coffee away onto the floor and shattering the ceramic cup into several pieces. You can't just say don't worry about it and think this will all be magically fixed. Izuku said nothing, but his eyes shone with the confusion and hurt of a man long accustomed to having had his hand of friendship slapped away. It hurt Katsuki to see that look on the man's face after so many years, but unlike the stupid child he used to be who thought he was too good to be friends with the boy, the man Katsuki had become was now too self-aware to allow himself to sully the green-haired hero's reputation. I come all the way down here. And for what? For some chicken shit, let's all get along bullshit. I ruined your fucking life, helped throw you out of school, and destroyed your dream, and what? You're just gonna stand there and try to be the bigger person? Fuck you. Izuku said nothing, but Katsuki saw the range of emotions flash behind his glassy green eyes, and for the first time in a long time, Katsuki saw the rage building behind those green eyes. It scared him a little bit. What? You got nothing to say? Katsuki pushed on, like a train running too fast towards a steep turn. Huh? Are you too much of a chicken shit to say something? A guy comes into your hero office and talks shit and what do? Stand there and take it like a bitch. Midoriya inhaled a breath through his nose, his vast shoulders heaving and tensing as he did so. The large man's entire body seemed like a metal coil, pulled back and ready to smash the idiot dumb enough to have added pressure to it. I'd leave if I were you, Izuku said silently, his eyes boring into Katsuki's like a killer whale would a fat seal walking over a thin sheet of ice. Katsuki could feel the tension with each word, like chains rattling against some great beast hiding in the shadows. Leave and never come back. I don't want to see you again, I don't want to hear you again, I don't even want to think about you again. Is the poor little baby gonna cry? I tried Bakugo, I really fucking did. But you're just never going to change, you're just going to be the same. Asshole you always were. Izuku said, his anger replaced with a weariness that seeped into his bones after wallowing in it for so long. Life is way too short for me to have you in my life any longer. Bakugo paused, the satisfaction of getting Izuku to see him the way Katsuki deserved to be seen momentarily overwhelmed by the pit of regret and loathing that crawled over Katsuki's skin. Was this what he really wanted? No. Did any of this make Katsuki feel better? No. Was it too late for him to change? Is it too late to swallow his pride, accept Deku's hand of forgiveness and move on with his life? Yes. The Deku doesn't want me in his life anymore. Oh, woe is fucking me. What the hell am I gonna do if the useless fucking Deku doesn't want to see me anymore? What the fuck was he doing? What was wrong with him? Had this all been inside him for this long, festering just under the surface of Katsuki's skin like some infection seeping into every word he spoke or every action he took? Cry me a river, you stupid extra. Just go before something bad happens to you, Bakugo. It's too early in the morning to deal with one of your little tantrums. What the fuck did you say? Do you want me to repeat myself slower for you or should I use smaller words? Fuck you. No fuck you. I can't believe how stupid I was to think even after everything that happened. Izuku shouted, more to himself than to Katsuki, every piece of shit scum fuck thing you've ever done to me, and you're still the egotistical dick you've always been. That son of a bitch. Katsuki stepped forward until he was mere inches away from the other man. There were a lot of unspoken rules that men had to follow when interacting with other guys. One such rule was that when a man willingly enters striking distance of a man he just insulted, he must be willing to face the consequences of such. And by God, did Katsuki want to face those consequences? Then throw the first fucking punch, you stupid Deku, Katsuki shouted, the desire to be the bad guy in Izuku's mind growing by the moment. Why don't you shut me up then? Get the fuck out of my face, Katsuki. And what are you gonna do about her? You gonna make me? If I have to, I will. But unless you want to get your ass beat and then get suspended just before the latest hero rankings, then be my guest and continue to be the big piece of shit you're being right now. Izuku said, his voice as hard as oak and snapping like a willow. He leered down at the shorter man, using every inch he had on Katsuki to emphasize how much larger and physically stronger the man before him was. Wouldn't want to jeopardize your chance at cracking the top 10 because you're an asshole, would you? The verbal jab was enough to pause Katsuki like the green-haired man knew which button to press at that exact moment. He really didn't want to do this, but especially not now. Not when the eyes of the country were on him, rumors swirling of Endeavor's upcoming retirement already making the late-night talk show rounds, and if half the shit he was hearing from his boss was any indication, then at least half of the top 25 rankings were about to get thrown on its ass in the coming days. Was Katsuki that self-destructive that he was willing to throw his potential professional future out of a moving car for something that should stay in the past? Katsuki took a deep breath, his mind reining in the anger bubbling just under the surface, the path in front of him becoming more evident with each passing moment. You have no idea? Katsuki started only to be interrupted by Izuku. Whatever bottled-up emotions he had carried awakened like some tidal wave ready to crash and destroy anything and everything in his path. Oh no, I must have forgotten how hard these past few years must have been for you. Katsuki felt the moisture glisten on his forehead as his entire body tensed from Izuku's words. The sarcasm was almost enough to send the explosion user into an existential crisis with each new poisoned word that tumbled out of the green-haired man's mouth. I should have thought about your feelings more. Would you please forgive me? Midoriya was done with the conversation, turning his back on Katsuki as he made his way to clean up the mess Katsuki had made, looking like an underpaid teacher trying to get a handle on some delinquent student making a fuss for attention. Izuku paid Katsuki no mind as the explosion user stood silently, each insult drying up alongside the explosion user's desire to argue and shout. Thank you for stopping by the Dikairu Hero Agency, where our motto is we can do anything. Izuku said, not even bothering to turn around to look at Katsuki again as he picked up the broken pieces of his coffee cup. Please come again when we can be of service to you. Don't turn your back on me, you fucking asshole. This conversation is over, Bakugo. I'm sorry we haven't grown up enough to not be shitty to each other, but I think. No wonder Ochako never wanted to fuck you. It was low, like the bottom of the barrel type of low, like the type of thing that would make it harder for Katsuki to look at himself in the mirror after all was said and done. So low that Katsuki almost felt his knees give out when Ochako's name left his lips. But Katsuki couldn't stand there feeling sorry for himself. Not when the 6.5-foot-tall form of Izuku Midoriya lurched forward like a panther descending on an unsuspecting antelope. For a moment, Katsuki was sure he was going to get hit. The thought that the bigger man just decided to throw him to the ground and beat him within an inch of his life for saying what he said only seemed to spur Bakugo's self-destructive tendency further than maybe he should have gone. You don't talk about her. You don't think about her. Izuku spat, rage and bile were spoken with every word. He looked like a man possessed, lost in his anger and resentment like a ship lost at sea without a lighthouse to guide it away from the jagged rocks of the shoreline. And you certainly don't get to use her fucking name because you're too much of a fucking asshole to get over yourself for a single goddamn. But you want to know a secret? She and I got close while you were away, you know? Katsuki dug the knife in deeper, a sick cocktail of satisfaction and abject horror overtaking his soul with each word he muttered. He watched the bigger man's face fall briefly, the hurt and pain that filled his eyes making Katsuki want to walk into oncoming traffic, but he had already come too far for whatever morality he had left to stop him. I know more about her than you ever did and ever will. You'd be amazed at the things we did while you ran away like a bitch. Now normally I don't kiss and tell. But if you want to hear the details. Katsuki smiled, pushing every ounce of smugness his body could produce to mask the turmoil that tore through the number 15 hero like a wildfire, burning strong iron oaks and leaving nothing more than gray ash in its place. He eyed his former friend's hands, scared and balled into fists that looked like sledgehammers, ready to turn stone and brick into powder. Izuku said nothing, but if looks could kill, then Katsuki would have been dead and buried before he even hit the ground, green eyes blazing like emeralds locked inside a brick oven. It had been a long time since he had seen those eyes, the raw emotion causing the grown man Katsuki was now to flinch just like the boy he had been all those years ago. But it wasn't the man's tightly bound fist that Katsuki had to worry about. So you and Ochako, huh? Izuku said, his voice like the growl of a demon whose hand was only being stalled by the angels of his better nature as he looked up and down Katsuki's all-too-stiff stance and found whatever he was looking at utterly lacking. Let me guess. She was the one who ended things, right? For a moment the world seemed to stop. The smugness and anger Katsuki wore like armor was left shredded into scrap metal at his feet. His insecurities and self-loathing leaving him naked as the day he was born as he let the other man's words descend onto him. Katsuki didn't realize he had hit Deku until he felt the force of his fist crash into Izuku's face, the green-haired man's head whipping to the side from the power delivered to his cheek. Izuku did not go down though, taking the punch with the practiced ease of a man who had long ago become accustomed to getting punched in the face. He only continued to look at Katsuki, green eyes never leaving Katsuki's red ones, like an apex predator getting ready to defend its territory against whatever poor interloper had decided to test its bark against his bite. I guess I'm gonna have to make you leave now.